WhatsApp group, especially because they just lost. They lost about an hour ago. It's just going off. Bang! It's just like the banter, just going back and forth, and it's not only the 90 minutes. It's the pre-game. It's the after game. And we're predicting what's going to happen. We're going through the fixtures, and it's quite sad and pathetic. I'm not going to lie to you, right? It's quite, when you actually think about it, just take a step back. It's quite sad and pathetic, but it's just, I can't explain it. It's just something that you can spend hours, not only watching the game. I'm talking about listening to other people talk about the game and their reaction to that game that you've watched. Do you know what I mean? And it's the biggest soap opera. And someone said it. I can't remember what she was saying. I can't remember who said, but she said something along the lines of, because I think she was talking about how men, talk about how like women like these reality TV shows and gossip. And she said sports is like your equivalent. And when she said that, and I thought about it, I was like, I couldn't say anything. I was like, she's got a point. Do you know what I mean? It's like the transfers. Oh, who's gonna come here? And we're watching this, and it's like it's madness. But I'm so emotionally invested in this thing that I can't explain why, really and truly, and it affects my mood.
It's so funny. It's so funny. Yeah, like I have so many stories to share in that sense because, like, when I married my wife, this was like 3 years ago. Like, because obviously when we're getting to know each other and all that kind of stuff, she didn't realize. She obviously knew I was really into cricket. And by the way, just gonna plug because I have a cricket podcast as well, so people can check that out. It's called The Cerebral Cricketer. So I interview some international players, domestic players, and stuff. So alhamdulillah, so I do that on the side. But anyhow, like, as like, living with her, and she, like, I didn't even realize, like, for a female, it's like a different world, because I don't even realize I do it subconsciously or even just like casually, where like I wake up, I might just check the cricket scores casually or the football scores casually, and then I get up, I might play the highlights in the background as I'm making breakfast, like things like that. I do so casually that I don't even think it's anything like, special in that sense. And then for females, it's like, what is this behavior? And then when I'm watching the game as well, like sometimes it's a really intense game and I'm like full like screaming like really loudly, and she's like, what is wrong with you? Like an animal. I'm like, and then the next day, when Man United defeated Man City, I think it was last week. Yeah, and there was a lot of viral videos going around where it was like, Man United supporters were like full celebrating, and then the wives were recording them like, this is my husband, is this normal behavior, ? And it was so funny because the day before that I was watching because the under-19 cricket World Cup's happening, so I was watching Bangladesh versus India, and it's because there's a lot of Bangladesh and India. There's a lot of political tension right now, and there's a lot of drama that actually happened. Like Bangladesh aren't going to play in the World Cup, and so that game happened in the under-19s World Cup, and so I was following that. And then when Bangladesh are doing well, I was full celebrating in the house, and my wife was literally asking me the same thing, like, oh wow, like, is this normal? Like, what are you doing? And then that stuff happened with the Man United supporters, and I'm like, I literally sent to her telling her like, look, this is normal. Look, this is literally what I was doing yesterday. So but it's crazy. And then it begs the question, like, why are we like this? I don't even know. Like, that's just how we are. Like growing up, even with mates, like with the boys, like when we hang out, I think obviously if you're religious and you have good brothers and stuff, obviously you're talking about Deen, Islam, this and that. But then I think if you're talking about general male population in the world, Muslim, non-Muslim, like football or cricket or any sport, it just brings everyone together. I think it's just a easy conversation to have with anyone, and it's just different. Like women don't have it in that sense the way the men do when it comes to sports. So definitely an interesting cultural phenomenon when it comes to sport. And I think, as I said, like before the podcast, like I think a lot of it with masculinity, how that works, and it's a way that we can kind of showcase our competitiveness, our even aggression, or the sense of victory. I think all that emotions and feelings can be captivated in sport. So I don't know, there's a lot there, I guess. Why I'm meant so into sport in that way.
Makes us our tribe, innit? It's just a way to like be tribal without being completely like just.
No, you're right. I think the tribal element, I agree 100%. It's a tribal because I get just as much satisfaction bantering my friends of rival teams as much as watching the game. So it's not only the game in and of itself, It's the bantering when their team loses and my team wins, and I get, like I said, more excitement when their team loses than when my team wins, kind of thing. Which is, so it's a tribal element and like the competitiveness as well. But I think definitely the tribal element, it definitely plays a part. And you can meet someone again, irrespective of what sport you follow, football, basketball, cricket, what have you. You meet someone that, especially if you're wearing maybe their jersey, you're in a different country, and someone sees you, automatically connect as if you're like long lost brothers or friends. It's hard to explain, but again, I can't think of anything other than sport that emotes that sense of unity and brotherhood amongst men, to be honest, and women who follow sports. I can't think of anything, honestly. And like you mentioned, Tasneem, a lot of women who are not interested in sport that way, they can't understand why men get so emotional from even watching a game, let alone, we're not even playing it, just even watching a game, how emotionally invested like men get. And I myself, who's someone who is avid football fan, I still can't understand why when my team loses, it affects me. It affects my mood. Do you know what I mean? I can't understand it. And again, you have to realize this. It's an emotional attachment that for some men have had since maybe they were like 6, 7 years of age. So they have an emotional attachment to this club, to this team, more than maybe their spouse, even more than their children. So it's bigger than family for some men. When you actually really think about it, it's like this club or this team they've been with you from the good times, the bad times. They've been there. So and a lot of us, and I'm seeing myself included, are more loyal to our team, our cricket team, football team, soccer team than almost anything else. And again, for some women listening, it might be like, that's quite troubling. It does sound troubling, but it's hard to explain unless you're like emotionally invested and understand. Because again, like I said, it's from childhood for many of us, so it's hard to kind of detach from it.
It becomes such
Did
a
you
big
have
part.
any experience? Did you have any experience in when you were growing up or when you were at school where if your team lost, for example, the next day you know that you're going to get bullied by by the opposition team where like your friends are sort of allied with? Like, because I had
Yep.
that phenomenon when I was in high school. Like, like my football team loses and I know that I'm going to get bullied the next day. Everyone's going to laugh at me and stuff like that. And I got my own separate clique with my supporters that will try to push back against the haters. So it was kind of like that tribal mentality in high school. Is pretty funny. Yeah,
I
the
still get
culture
it.
is crazy.
It's all the time. It still happens. So again, it's all part of the banter and you have to be ready. It's like when your team loses, it's like it's not just you that's going to be upset. It's like you're going to receive a lot of ridicule, and the memes are going to be sent to even at work. I get messages like from senior managers and things that will come to me, and I've got other members in my team that work in finance who was like wondering, why is it like this senior person's coming to speak to you or giving you this note? Because it's all around football. It's all around soccer. They can't understand it like the other members of the team who obviously don't follow football. That banter, that camaraderie that we have is purely based on sport. But it's really good in the sense of it does bring people together, irrespective of their religion, their race, even age. It's really good in terms of not only being an icebreaker if you're meeting someone new, but also to connect people. And again, when you break, and when people see like the human side or the humor of you, and then all of a sudden you can talk about other stuff. That's one of the good things I do love about sports, because like I mentioned earlier, before we started recording, I went through a period where I stopped watching football for like 3 years. Because when I was studying a lot and I went abroad, I was thinking, no, I can't watch football. Not that I believed it was haram, but I was just like very focused and laser focused. It's only when I came back and I realized actually it's a really good icebreaker and really good to like break the ice and connect with people and build camaraderie without me talking about, what they might speak about, like going ice skiing or going to the pub or doing some other activities that I'm not interested in. Football's one thing or sports that brings a lot of people together, especially men.
Yeah, definitely. And I might actually, we'll start doing an intro because I know that we sort
Oh
of,
yeah.
didn't started the podcast, but yeah, because we were talking about a lot about sport and different topics prior to the I'm like, let's just start recording. But, I appreciate you coming on the show again. I know that we've had you on before. And as I was mentioning to you offline, we covered a lot of topics, mashallah, and alhamdulillah, in the last episode, but there was a lot of topics that we probably didn't cover, which I've thought like I needed to get you back on and talk about, inshallah. So I'll give a quick intro. So Habeeb Akande is a British-Nigerian writer, sex expert, and historian. He's the author of 7 published books on race and sex in African and Muslim cultures. His main research interests include women's sexual rights Eroticism and the Female Orgasm in Islam and African Cultures. As a public speaker, erotologist, and cross-cultural sex educator, Habeeb carries our workshops on the clitoris, kunyaza, and female ejaculation at the international conferences and leading universities. So, assalamu alaikum, Habeeb Akande, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much for having me. I didn't think he was going to invite me back, to be honest, after the last episode, but no, Jazakallah khairan for inviting me.
No, I was telling you, like, the conversation really flowed. I thought it was really natural, and those kind of conversations, alhamdulillah, like, it did get a lot of traction online. I think it really hits. I think it really, like, alhamdulillah, like, the way we cover those topics, it's not really covered, unfortunately, as widely as we would like it to be across the Muslim community. Like, I find that because of the whole culture wars and that whole tussle between the alt-right and feminism and those kind of discussions, it doesn't get covered the way it should, with that kind of nuanced take, and especially from the Islamic paradigm, how it should be. So it was really a breath of fresh air. Like, I have a question actually. Like, do you find that there's other people covering these topics the way that you feel that you've covered? Because I personally, I know there's obviously people talk, oh, there's this sheikh, that sheikh talking about it, but there's a difference between just, being, people will be like, pro, quote unquote, pro-feminist, but then talking about in a very nuanced way from the Islamic tradition, and also talking about, the ethics of Islam, and, not taking advantage of, being legalese and trying to take advantage of things in a certain way. I don't think it gets covered that way. But do you find that you're sort of the one in this space, or do you have a community of other people that you try to fall back on to talk about these kind of topics?
Very good question. I would say there are not many, and that's the reason why I'm talking a lot about it, because I think there are people that want to or interested in this topic. Some people, because what I found is that people might speak about sex and intimacy or issues in the Muslim community from personal experiences or what they've seen on the ground, but not tying it into the tradition, because maybe they haven't had the traditional training. And then those who are speaking about sex and intimacy, like more from, you could say, like a theoretical perspective, but not tying it down and how can you make it practical for everyday Muslim audiences, and understanding what is happening on the ground in the reality. And also understand, it's all well and good saying, women have rights in Islam, which we do know, and that, intimacy is important in marriage and this, that, and the other. But what has happened or trying to explain to people that how Islam or intimacy was understood in early Muslim communities, and by many of our Muslim scholars who wrote about sex and intimacy very candidly, to where we are now, where sex is seen to be very much of a taboo topic in many Muslim cultures, and trying to understand why that is. I don't think many people are doing that. I think there are some women now who are more talking out about it, like Angelica Lindsay Ali, Ifet Rafiq, when they've had some religious training. But I think, unfortunately, in many of our communities, because they're women, they don't really get the limelight and the validation that maybe a man, like I would get, because I'm a man speaking. And I've also obviously studied and trained at Al-Azhar, so I've got some, you could say, respect in that way. But I'm not the only one that's speaking about it. But in the English speaking sphere, I don't see that many, if I'm going to be completely honest with you. And if there was more speaking about this topic, I'll take a back seat, because I don't really want to talk about this too much, because initially I was speaking about like anti-black racism and in the Muslim community and some problematic views that were within our tradition, because that was something I was quite passionate about. Since then, a number of people have been speaking out about it, especially since the whole Black Lives Matter movement. That's why now I don't speak about race anymore, or very rarely, kind of thing, because there's other people that are doing even a better job than I was doing or could do like 10 or 15 years ago. So similarly, I'm trying to like raise awareness so people will realize that the topic of sex and intimacy, erotology, shouldn't be a taboo in our Muslim spaces, in our Muslim consciousness, and trying to tie it back to our tradition. Of course, doing it in a way that is dignified and speaking about it in a way that's not vulgar or anything. But for some people, because they've not come across this, they will be naturally shocked just by someone speaking about sex and Islam in the same, or like orgasm or women's pleasure or clitoris in the same sentence as speaking about our tradition, not realizing, for many of them, not realizing that many of our great scholars that we revere spoke candidly about this, and even the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, spoke about this at length, and women felt empowered during his time to ask him very much intimate questions that many of us now would be extremely uncomfortable to kind of hear even a woman asking a sheikh about certain questions. So Yeah, so going back to your question, unfortunately, I don't think there are enough people speaking out about it. That's why I'm trying to also, again, encourage more people to kind of speak about it from, obviously, like an Islamic framework.
You
By giving
mentioned
them the
something
resources as
interesting,
well. So that's
actually.
also what I'm trying to do, giving them the resources. So it's not just this, some people might think this sex-craved black guy from London who's just speaking about sex. Because also, I might need to say this, not a disclaimer, but just kind of like my position. Because some people have asked me, they think that I've been accused of being a simp, pro-women, man-hating, hate polygamy. And I'm like, where are you getting this? But maybe, again, because I'm raising awareness of calling out certain malpractices. Now, obviously, by way of background, I'm a Muslim, alhamdulillah, Sunni Muslim. I do adhere to, you could say, the madhab route of following predominantly like the Maliki madhab. Although I respect Salafism, I don't adhere to the Salafi interpretation, understanding of Islam. I do respect Sufism, but I don't adhere to any Sufi tariq or anything like that. But because sometimes I might cite or quote some classical scholars from Sufism or Salafism, I've been labeled different things, and it's like, no, I've tried to. I'm Sunni. That's definitely where I stand, and that's my position. But in terms of appreciating scholars or individuals from other traditions, I don't see any harm in that. But and again, I'm not against polygamy. I'm from Nigeria. Polygamy is a cultural norm. Many members of my family, both male and female alike, are in polygynous relationships. I'm against unethical polygyny. I'm against people exploiting a religion. I'm against religious manipulation. I'm against spiritual abuse. I'm against sexual violence. That's what I'm against. And I don't believe that is part of our tradition. So what I'm calling out that some people, especially some brothers, get upset with is I'm calling out some of these malpractices that I've seen, not only seen myself, but also I'm being informed of. So I'm letting people know some of the malpractices that take place and why some brothers have had, maybe you could say, a different understanding of marriage and sex and intimacy compared to maybe what women have, and also compared to what is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah, what many of our classical scholars have said. That's what I'm trying to help people understand, that of course we know that marriage is important in our deen and zina is haram, but a lot of people are exploiting, you could say, nikah to essentially have illicit relationships, but under an Islamic guise, or they're using red pill talking points to basically justify taking advantage, exploiting and abusing women. So that's what I'm highlighting with some of the work that I'm doing, where I think some people maybe have not really familiar with my content and not read my books, because that's also a big problem that a lot of Muslims don't read, unfortunately. So that's why they go off maybe certain reels or clips or certain videos, and they just make an impression that, oh, that's the way I am. I'm either a feminist or a simp, or I hate Muslim men, or I hate polygyny. And that's far from the truth. But I am against sexual exploitation, religious manipulation, and spiritual abuse. And again, I just think for me as well, as a man, we talk a lot about ghayrah, having protective jealousy. And a lot of brothers will talk about having protective jealousy over women, now women folk. You should have more protective jealousy over Allah and His Messenger, over the deen. If you see people exploiting the deen, misusing the deen, you should have more protective jealousy, from my opinion, in terms of standing up, calling that out. Not to say that you don't protect your wife and your daughters, but seeing malpractices of certain individuals that are manipulating, because I've studied and I see what people are doing, that's what I'm calling out. Or I'm calling out where people will give maybe a certain opinion. It's a opinion, it might be a valid opinion, but there are other opinions which are just as valid within our tradition that many people are not aware of. So that's what I'm bringing to light. So that's where I get accused sometimes of being a feminist or against brothers, because sometimes brothers will give a very, very conservative opinion, which again, it's an opinion, a scholarly opinion, it might be valid, but there are also other opinions from other scholars which are just as valid, that are empowering women or allowing women to maybe go to the mosque and learn about the deen that they're not being informed of. So that's where, again, I think there's maybe a disconnect from some people who maybe haven't appreciated to hear where I'm coming from, and they just think I'm just out here trying to attack the brothers and campaign for women. But that's definitely not the case, in the sense of just attacking the brothers. So I just wanted to put that out.
I think it's interesting because it speaks to perhaps the lack of maturity in many segments of the community, where essentially, if you are trying to have a balanced take, and to them it comes across as, oh, look, you're being too feminist, then you get called a simp, and all these labels get put onto you, and therefore they sort of try to reject you or sort of portray in a way that you're not speaking from the tradition, right? And unfortunately, there's this binary like, okay, you either have to be on my team, however, it looks like it could be maybe the manosphere side of things, or if you're showing tendencies of, I don't know, empathy towards women, then you get labeled a feminist and a simp and all that kind of stuff. But in reality, like, and this is my perspective as well when it comes to, and it's not really that controversial, but I would like to get your thoughts as well, because you mentioned earlier about female validation, right? And for me, it's like, as a Muslim, if you're truly firm on your deen and you want to practice you want to be on the truth, right? Essentially, you should be having a balanced take and take every opinion for what it is and try to understand it. And this even comes to not just in the fiqh or in the books or in the Islamic books, but just in life in general, right? And I think we sort of touched on this on the last episode, where there's that lack of, firstly, emotional intelligence. There's a lack of understanding the human condition. There's all these things that are just lacking when it comes to learning the Islamic tradition, where many years ago it wasn't like that. Like, they would be learning akhlaq for many years before they even touch the books. But we don't live in that world now. Like, people have all the information at their fingertips, or there's all these courses and there's all this sort of stuff, so people are just jumping into the courses and learning the books, which is fine. Not saying it's bad or wrong, but there's all this work that needed to have been done before even touch the books to balance the self and the human being. But people have this kind of black and white view, and they don't realize that it's their personality kind of, they're projecting their own personality biases onto the books, and then trying to back project it onto Islam. But those kind of subtleties and nuances about when it comes to personalities or understanding people are completely missing, right? So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and then I also wanted to ask you, like, I think it would be a good segue into talking about masculinity. Like, what does that look like? Like, what is Islamic masculinity, and especially in the environment where we're in, like, there's Andrew Tate and the Manosphere and the alt-right culture really seeping into the minds of the Muslims, right? Like, I remember previously, like, all the Muslims were jumping onto Andrew Tate and saying all this stuff, like, how great he is and this and that. And only now recently, people are saying, oh, wait, is he actually practicing Islam properly? Because there was videos of him doing this and that, and it was in, sacred months and all these kind of conversations. And it's a repeating thing. Like, every time there's someone or a convert that comes into the deen, or the way, even, like, for example, Jordan Peterson, I remember we've had this conversation quite a few times on the podcast. We've had guests on, talked about this, where people, like, this was like years ago when he interviewed, I think, Mohammed Hijab, or did a conversation with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. They're like, mashallah, like, I'm sure his heart's firm on deen and Islam. But then, he does that tweet out of nowhere about, bomb them all, I think, in the context of Israel and Palestine. So then it kind of makes you think, like, wait, does it have to get to that point for people to realize that these people aren't what they think they are, just because they may be anti-feminist, quote unquote, or maybe even Ben Shapiro at some point, like, Muslims were like lapping him up, right? But then, it was very clear from the beginning, like, the way that they talk about certain topics, even when it comes to feminism, it means, like, this is not someone to ally with. Yeah, like, maybe on one point, maybe LGBTQ issue or abortion, maybe one issue, there might be slight parallels. I wouldn't even say 100%, but then we sort of talk as if, they're almost Muslim in the way that they portray things, but they're not. So yeah, I'd like to sort of get your thoughts on, regarding the whole feminist conversation, and I guess that nuanced take that was sort of lacking in this current day and age. And also, like, I think a lot of, as Muslims, like, the male gaze, like, we project it so much into the way what we think the world should be seen, but in reality, it's only like a part of how we should view the world. Like, there's a nuanced take of understanding different ways of seeing the world, and then coming to your conclusion, as opposed to, I'm just going to trust however I think and feel about things, and then just say that, no, that's Islam, So I'd just like to get, if you see this phenomenon, if you've observed it in the Muslim community.
Yeah, I have. I mean, with the manosphere and the appeal that many Muslim men, I would say young and even middle-aged Muslim men, had towards certain things that you mentioned in the manosphere, like Andrew Tate and the Jordan Peterson, I never understood it, because for me, and I actually was featured in an article with CNN I think 2003 when he first converted. I called him out a number of times. I said he's a grifter, right? I'm not talking about his Islam. I'm not talking about his Islam. That's between him and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm talking about a lot of what he was doing even before he became Muslim. He's a grifter, right? So he caught controversy, he says salacious things to get a reaction. And I just thought it was a grifter, but that's maybe me being a man in his 40s looking at it and seeing it for what it is. So I couldn't see what people was attracted to. I just thought it's entertainment, right? Whereas a lot of younger men and impressionable men, and even some men that were my age, were really attracted and inspired by what he was saying. I couldn't understand what it was, because for me, again, it was a character. But I think some of it is a lot of men are attracted to performative masculinity, this very alpha male, so to speak, looking figure, like a WWE wrestler, like a Hulk Hogan-like image character, or The Rock. And for a number of Muslim men, especially those of us who are like the three of us, brown in complexion, a number of Muslim men have an identity crisis and a deep inferiority complex where they want validation, especially from the white man. Whether that comes from Jordan Peterson, I know Andrew Tate is mixed race, but they're seeking validation from someone who looks what they consider to be, quote unquote, the ideal man. Because a lot of what he was saying, other people were saying something similar, but he's got the look that a number of men, young Muslim men, maybe aspire to have. And some of what he was doing, he's very clever, like saying that a man should be a provider, should look after his wife. That's nothing new. Many imams have been saying that. That's from our tradition. But obviously he was saying it in a way, some in a comical way, and because of, again, his physique and having cars around him, that's why I think, again, it attracted a lot of men. But so that's why, rather than condemning him or condemning the men who were enticed or attracted to what Andrew Tate's message and or the Manosphere's message, I was trying to understand what is it about what they're saying that they like. And again, I don't want to just blame the religious leaders, because I think that's a cop-out to say that they haven't been teaching masculinity, and that's why you've had these figures that have been able to, like, fill the void, so to speak. Because there are some Muslims that I know of, younger men as well, who didn't. They saw it for what it was. And it's like, these are a lot of men who are insecure, who don't like women. A number of them are misogynistic. A number of them maybe have got no game. And some of them might be homosexual for the way they're speaking. Because I couldn't understand, why would a grown-ass man be constantly berating and condemning and belittling women? I don't understand that. I've not come from that world. But there are some men who like that. The same way there are some men who get off from watching men, what's that word they call it in Corn? Destroy women, humiliate women, pummel women. These are some terms that people like. They want to see aggressive acts done onto women because they don't like women. They like women in a sense of having intimate relations with them, but they don't like them as human beings. They don't value them. They don't appreciate them. That's why you find, and they'll use the religion to kind of justify this. That's why they don't want to listen to a woman's voice, because they will say, it's fitna. I can't listen to her because she's going to arouse me. Let me keep it away. It's because they don't respect her. They don't respect what she's saying. But they'll have a non-Muslim man or man speaking, and they'll listen to him. And that's something that we have to be honest with ourselves, that there's a lot of misogynistic sentiment in many of our cultures, but they try to use Islam to justify it, that no, women should be at home to cook and clean and look after the kids. They're fitna, that's why we can't listen to them. And what it comes down to is a lot of his misogyny. There's deep ingrained misogyny in many of our cultures, that they don't respect women and they don't want to hear what women have got to say. So when you've got a figure like Andrew Tate, who's kind of, you could say that the confirmation by saying what they already believe, they're going to be attracted to that. If you don't hold those views and those beliefs about women and about how men should be, this performative masculinity, this alpha masculinity that's more like a cartoon character figure or like a wrestler, you're just going to see it for what it is and maybe see it as light-hearted entertainment or dark entertainment, but you're not going to be enticed by it. But if that's what you actually like and what you want to see, you are going to be attracted to it. Do you understand what I'm getting at? That's the way I see it. So I don't blame only these figures, because they are saying something that is speaking to the subconscious or the conscious of a number of men who like that, who want to hear that, but he's giving them a voice. So it's the same way where, rather than teaching men about the importance of practicing sexual discipline, being someone who's honorable, being someone who's a man of integrity, you can listen to someone who's just talking about the problems in the world is because of women, it's because of feminism, it's because of the way women are dressed. And then you use Islamic language to kind of justify it, to say that's why Allah says that women should wear the hijab and this, that, and the other. Do you understand? Rather than looking from within as men and saying, I should do better, I should maybe practice sexual discipline, I maybe should not be lusting and looking after so many of these girls online. Like I saw a tweet and I can't remember the person's name, but they said she quoted something like on the lines of she was speaking to like there are a number of men who watch porn but they don't respect the porn actresses. They follow naked girls on Instagram, but they don't think these women are worthy of respect. They commit adultery and fornication, but they want a faithful woman. And these men still think that they're better than these women, when in reality they're hypocrites. And that is what it is. You have a lot of men who have this mindset. They'll be quick to criticize a Muslim woman because she's wearing makeup, she's not wearing a hijab, she's doing this, she's doing that. But they don't talk about the malpractices of men in general, or a lot of men, even if they are, come across to be religious or exploiting people. They don't talk about it. And it's easy to punch down is easy. And this is something that when we speak about masculinity or Islamic masculinity, the Prophet ﷺ, he swore by Allah that he's going to protect the rights of the two most vulnerable people in society, women and orphans. This is what it means to be a man. So this idea that, and that's why, again, I don't understand this, is it MGTOW, men going their own way? And like, I mean, if you're saying men going their own way, so if you don't want anything to do with women, what, you just want to be with men? Again, I don't understand that mentality, but some men like that. Or red pill, and again, it's either one or the other. Either you're red pill, manosphere, or feminist. And that's not, there's a lot of people that's in the middle. Not everything about feminism do I agree with, and there's not everything about red pill that I agree with, or manosphere, but there are some talking points that they're both saying where there are some truths, but there's not that, like you mentioned about the maturity and the nuance. There aren't those conversations that's been had, so people are kind of stuck on one or two camps, and they kind of see things as very binary, which again is very problematic, and I don't think that's what our tradition, our religion teaches. And again, I don't even want to say it's a young man's problem, because there are men who are of age, who've got children, who've got a career, who have this very binary mindset as well, which I find extremely problematic. But again, rather than just criticizing them, I'm trying to understand where they're coming from. What is it about this rhetoric that appeals to you? And I think, again, a lot of men do have somewhat of an identity crisis, and they're looking at for figures such as these. I don't want to keep talking about Andrew Tate as well, because I think he's like a punching bag for, and again, he's still our Muslim brother. He's still our Muslim brother. So, and I'm not going to be name dropping people, but I'm always wondering, why is it a number of Muslims, and I'm not having a go, I'm just saying we're very comfortable to name drop Andrew Tate, but there are other people in the Dawah sphere, the Dawah bros, who are doing very similar things, but we don't name drop them. I'm trying to wonder, why is it that he's not good? Because he's still a Muslim. He's our Muslim brother. He's been Muslim for over 2 or 3 years. Again, doesn't mean there's a lot of things I do people don't agree with, but he seems like we can throw his name out and say, oh, is it because he's the most famous? But there are other people who are credible within the Muslim community who gave him a platform. But we don't name drop them. We don't talk about them. We kind of cover them up. We kind of insinuate who we're speaking about. But with Andrew Tate, we name drop him. Again, Jordan Peterson is different because he's not a Muslim. So I'm wondering, why is it he's kind of seen as an acceptable person to kind of talk about and just blame him as if it's all his fault? It's not all his fault. He's saying what a lot of men wanted to do and believed. That's the way I look at it. So rather than just putting the figure on Andrew Tate and saying, oh, if we get rid of Andrew Tate, now it's okay. It's like a lot of those sentiment that the misogynistic sentiment he's been relaying. I think a lot of Muslim men still have that mindset. And I'm saying that's a problem. I think we need to kind of tackle and address that without, again, just criticizing the men and saying they're misogynistic. Just talk about what is your understanding of masculinity? What does it mean to be a husband? What does it mean to be a man? And I think that's also very important to kind of educate, and then obviously tie it back to the best of creation, the best man to ever walk this earth, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Because words or concepts like you use or mention about having empathy for women, that's something that a lot of men will consider to be simpish or effeminate. That was a character of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we talk about what it means to be modest, most people would associate that with women. The Prophet was the most shyest of individuals, man and woman alike. That's how he was described. So when we talk about haya and shyness, don't only attribute it to women, attribute it to men as well. But again, we don't attribute that to women. That's a female trait. What do we attribute to men? What is masculinity? To be strong, to be virile, to be a provider. Yeah, that's all true. but also, like you mentioned, about having empathy, having mercy, and standing up for what is wrong, standing up for injustice. That's also part of a masculinity that, for whatever reason, that type of masculinity that's from our Sunnah, that's from the Prophet, peace be upon him, I think we kind of neglect that, or we kind of don't really talk about that as much, because again, it's very easy to punch down and speak ill of women, and it's very easy to speak about people that's very far away because they're seen as to be larger than life or so huge, because you know that they're not going to come back to you. I can talk about Andrew Tate because you know that 9 times out of 10 is more than likely than not he's not going to respond to you. But people within your remit that is doing just as much horrific things, and they have got the impact, we don't talk about them. We cover that up. Oh, he's my brother. He's hopefully he made a mistake. We will say things like, he made a mistake. We need to protect his sins. We need to advise him privately. But people that we know that won't answer back, we can talk about them. And that, to me, that is a form of cowardice. That's not masculinity, because you know you pick and choose your fights. You know who you can attack and who you can speak about, because you know they're not going to respond because you're too small for them in terms of like the social media world, so to speak. But you talk and bully and talk about women online who are sitting in their car talking about things that you want to put up their picture and saying that this is a problem with feminism and Muslim women, and your defense is, we need to educate our sisters and our daughters not to go down that route. So you do that, you pick on the woman, the innocent woman by herself, maybe because she's wearing makeup or got eyelashes and you're aroused by that or what have you. You will pick on her, but the preacher or that's all saying all of these misogynistic things or anti-women things, and you won't say anything about that. You keep quiet, but you say, no, I'm advising him privately. What do you? When I speak to brothers, I'll say things like, do you think Umar bin Khattab would behave like that? The companions that you look up to and revere, and when we're in the brother circle, we talk about, do you think that they would have tolerated or behaved that way? They would have called the stuff out. They would have called the men out. But we are, and I'm saying we as a community, we're very comfortable to see brothers call women out, especially those that don't have a support system. But calling other brothers out that can respond, no, we don't do that. We just call the big ones out that we know are not going to respond to us. So me, that's not part of the masculinity that I think Islam is encouraging us to have, and Allah knows best.
I think on that point, and this is unfortunate, I won't name drop names because I actually know the brother, but I will say is that there's another podcast that actually ended up not to say that podcast actually calls out women. I'm not claiming that, but it's speaking to the phenomenon that you're talking about, that guys are more likely, or certain groups of guys are going to call out on women on the smallest things and make it a big issue and talk about how, and then kind of jump to that kind of misogynistic understanding of Islam and sort of project it and talk about all these examples that they're observing in society. Whereas for the guys, there's more leniency, there's more leeway. There seems to be like, oh, no matter how bad they are, then it doesn't matter because there's still a guy and put them on a pedestal. Like there was one example on they actually another podcast ended up platforming, and I didn't know at the time. I thought it was a great podcast. Like I don't mind obviously when guys are talking about their struggles or whatever. And this was in particular, this guy was a musician. So at the time when I was listening, I'm like, okay, that's pretty cool. He has all these insights about Deen and he's talking about this lifestyle that he's in and this and that. I'm not saying music's haram or making that clear. I'm saying more so like the lifestyle he was partaking in when it comes to like clubs and drinking, that kind of culture. I'm like, okay, he's kind of highlighting how the not as much benefit is in this lifestyle and how he's trying to become better. So I'm like, okay, that's pretty good. And then a year later, I came across this guy's socials, and I didn't know this at the time, but he ended up being basically what's the term? Like he has a prostitution business, well, like what's the word, like for a guy, a pimp. Is basically in that sense, yeah. And I was like shocked. I'm like, I did not know that he was actually a pimp when I was listening to his podcast a year ago, and then it just kind of boggled my mind that wait, like that podcast ended up platforming a pimp. I'm sure, I don't know if Nadeem probably knows who I'm referring to here.
I'm trying to think, but I don't think so.
Okay, anyway, so I'll say the name. The guy, his friends are Harami. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's pretty popular in
Oh, okay,
UK.
yeah, okay, I know. Okay, we can talk because he openly. Okay, that's a good example. Thank you. I'm glad you
Because
mentioned that.
he was
But
platformed by Muslims, right? And
thank
I was
you.
boggled. Because I didn't know at the time that he was like that, and then I only found out later when I came across his story because one of his posts was going viral, and it was about some conversation he was having with a girl, and I was
Yeah.
like boggled. I'm like, wait, is this the same guy that I listened to a year ago? Which I was kind of inspired in a sense by. So that was a bit crazy, yeah.
So I'm glad
Subhanallah.
you
So
mentioned
yeah,
that.
you'll see.
Yeah, because there was I forgot his a sociologist from the UK, Dr. William Barlow. And I did repost a couple of clips on my social media. He spoke out about this. He's a sociologist, and he was talking about like the double standards in the Muslim community and he mentioned like Friends of Harami because he openly speaks about, and he's been platformed, like he said, on various Muslim podcasts and platforms in the UK, talking about his struggles, his life. He's a rapper, and he openly speaks about him pimping women, right? So I'm not saying anything that he hasn't said, but people empathize with him because they hear his story, they hear where he's coming from. Inshallah, he was, he's going to give, even if you read the comments, because they see he's still a human being, right? He's still our brother in Islam, even though what he's talking about is foul. But I'm wondering, why is it that a lot, and that's what the sociologists were saying, they don't platform or they don't give any grace to Muslim women who are being pimped. Because remember, there are Muslim women some of them who are working as prostitutes, either they've been coerced or that's the lifestyle that they've chosen. Again, no one is saying it's halal, no one is justifying it. But I'm saying, why is it that we don't have that same level of grace and empathy to hear their stories? Like there was a couple that he mentioned, Muslim women like porn stars, and he mentioned like one of them went through like a really troubled marriage, arranged marriage, and then she went through abuse, and then this was like her way of making money. Now again, I'm not justifying it, but we can hear the story of a brother who is speaking about why he's selling drugs, why he went into gang life or killing someone, and we can empathize because we hear his story. But we don't hear enough stories of the women because we're not interested in that, and that's why also I think a lot of Muslims will find it very difficult to empathize with women because you don't hear enough of their stories. But when you read many of the hadiths, the Prophet, even the Quran, Allah speaks about in one of the verses about don't coerce women into prostitution because you're trying to seek worldly benefit. Because and these were Muslim women in the community who were coerced. There were slave girls, Musaycha is one of the ladies' name, and I forgot the second, but were coerced into prostitution. There's another hadith, I think it's in Bukhari, where the Prophet mentions about a man who went out and gave charity, and then people was asking him, this individual, why are you giving charity to these individuals? One of the individuals this man gave sadaqah to, charity to, was a prostitute. And then when they asked him, why are you giving money to a prostitute? He said, because I hope that she'll end that practice. A lot of women who are in prostitution, it's not out because they want to. It's not because they are just want to sleep with multiple men. Again, not justifying. I'm just saying when you understand someone's story, you realize, I can understand why people are in that situation or why they chose that route. Because we don't hear enough of those stories in our religious spaces, we just look at them as evil people. We condemn them to hell as if they've got no humanity in them, as if they've got no iman in them. Someone could be a prostitute and still believe in Allah and His Messenger. But for us, I think we find it very difficult to fathom. But we can understand or rationalize a man can be selling drugs, a murderer, even a pimp, and still be Muslim and still, inshallah, it's going to change because we don't want to hear women's stories because we have this, like the Freud, how he coined the Madonna whore complex. We just want to hear from the pure, perfect, saintly woman. Any woman that's got any flaws, we don't want to hear about them. But some of these women, some of these men are still lusting after these women. So it's a real disconnect because you lusting after them, you want them for their sexual services, but you don't see the humanity in them. You don't see them as human beings. And I'm saying that's a problem. So I'm glad you mentioned that, brother, because he made another podcast, I think a couple of weeks ago, went viral. And again, he's saying it so candidly and openly. But he's not, the one thing to be fair, he's not justifying it. So even when he's on the Muslim podcast, he does say he's not justifying or trying to say it's halal, but I'm not condoning it, I'm just saying he's just talking about his lifestyle. But I'm wondering, why is it they don't offer, like, again, that same grace to Muslim women who are also not only prostitutes, I'm just saying, who are struggling. They don't even want to hear them. The only women that they would generally platform is a woman who is wearing a niqab, doesn't really, it's not going to speak out against some of what the prevalent narrative is in terms of the way a woman should be. So they want only a certain type of woman that they want to speak to. If it's a woman that's not wearing a hijab, or she doesn't necessarily, or even if she's a feminist, they don't even want to hear her. And I'm saying that's a problem. Why is it you don't even want to hear where they're coming from? Why is it that a lot of women are gravitating towards feminism? Because they will listen or try and understand why men are gravitating towards the Manosphere, Red Pill, Andrew Tate, and they said, okay, we need to do something about it. And I've heard so many imams and religious leaders, they'll say, I don't agree with Andrew Tate, but he says some good things. I don't agree with Rollo Tomasi, but he does say some good things about traditional masculinity, about this. But feminism, they equate feminism to like worshipping Fir'aun, or as if it's complete kufr. Like there's no, like feminism is the worst thing that's ever happened, but they won't even acknowledge the good that some feminists and Muslim feminists have said. You have to be fair and balanced. It's like I don't believe in feminism. I don't subscribe to it, but I can't deny that they have pushed and advocated for good things for women that Muslims should be advocating for within our tradition. The same way, as a black person, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, a lot of Muslims wasn't speaking about anti-black racism within the community until non-Muslims were speaking about it with the Black Lives Matter. That's when I was seeing a lot of Arab and Asian and white Muslims that say, no, we need to talk about this issue within our community. But prior to that, they don't want to hear it. I'm like, generally, they didn't want to talk about the systemic racism which exists in Muslim countries, also not only towards black people, but also towards Muslims from the Indian subcontinent that happens in the Gulf region. They don't want to talk about that. Like we don't, because there's no such thing as racism in Islam, and Bilal was black, so therefore there can't be racism in the Muslim community. And it's just like, we know that don't play with, we're not saying that there's racism in Islam or in the time of or that it's allowed, but we know it exists in the Muslim community. The same way feminists, they're talking about issues that are going on in Muslim communities. We know that Islam gave women rights, but the way a number of preachers and certain religious figures will shut them down and say, Islam gave women all their rights, you don't need feminism. It's just like, but women are not given their rights, and then they're not also told about their rights, their Islamic rights. That's also a problem. So this is where I just think I don't know if the brothers who say this are being disingenuous or they're not aware of what they're saying, because I think a number of brothers, especially from very conservative communities, they don't have much interaction with women who have different views to them to counteract them, because obviously their wife, or maybe also their daughter, maybe their mother and stuff, they're not going to be challenged, because do you understand? In a way, you need someone outside of your bubble to challenge you or maybe make you see something differently. The same way, like you mentioned, Tanzim, when you heard friends of haramis, okay, you learned something different. Okay, that's a lifestyle that maybe you're not accustomed to, or your friendship group. But hearing his story and hearing what he's talking about, maybe you can kind of like see where he's coming from, not necessarily agreeing with that. Likewise, why is it we're not offering that same grace to women who have different lifestyles or different perspectives? Because that's also something I've never understood, because the way people talk about Islam are presenting it as if it's a man's religion, and it's not a man's religion. It's a religion for humanity. The same way Islam is not a religion just for Arabs or for Asians or for Africans. It's for humans. But why do we get, mashallah, when we see a white person with blue eyes and blonde hair convert? Why do we get so excited and so happy? Because like, mashallah, oh my God, he speaks Arabic so well. Why do we have that amazement? But if it's a brown-skinned person or a black person, it's just like, okay, we don't even, like, it's expected. But if they came from Hinduism or they came from Christianity, like, why is it that we still don't have that same reverence and, like, impressed by it? Because the white person, for the white person to become Muslim, they must know Islam is the truth.
Yeah, it's interesting to mention that, actually. I came across an example. It's kind of the opposite, but I think it proves your point, actually. And it was like a famous preacher. The name's not really relevant. He's very, very well known. But he posted this thing, and it was Muslims in Gambia, right? And it's like, mashallah, even in Gambia, man. And you're like, are you kidding me? Like, how do you not know the history of Islam in West Africa and Gambia, and like and it's like, mashallah, they're reading Quran so beautifully, and it's like, well, yeah, of course, man. There's like plenty of madrasas there. Like, it's just mind-boggling that you can kind of like, and this particular preacher is actually from South Africa, which may give away who it is, but you would just like assume, like, it's bizarre to me. But sorry, come back to the earlier points about kind of like, I don't know who's the Friends of Harami guys. I just googled him. But it was like another example, a bizarre example from my life actually. So like many years ago, I was hanging out with these guys, right? Who were like hardcore madkhalis. And these guys were just so strange because they would roll around in like a minivan, and they were selling drugs at this minivan, but they would be there like talking about like really high level aqeedah texts, right? So they're talking about like these aqeedah texts and they share, and then at the same time, but that's not the point. The point is these guys were doing that, and it was well known that they were drug dealers, and at home their wives. I hope they don't want me saying this. They're actually now kind of reformed, but at home their wives were niqabis, and they were like teaching the Quran and so on and so forth. So it's like these guys, like what's his name, Frenzo Harami, which is such a bizarre name, and these kind of like individuals who talk about the gangster life. I don't think it threatens the deen as these people know it. Right, the deen is control for them. Maybe I'm not actually. I'm not sorry to say it. I think very plainly to me it is control over others, control over women, control over the racial inferior, right? In that sense. So these guys, they can come and talk about being a literal pimp, right? But it doesn't affect their worldview of, it doesn't challenge their worldview of, actually, I am at the top, where I should be, and women are still at the bottom, and that's fine. And this guy's fine. Okay, fine. He's a little bit sinful, but he's not, he's not elevating women to, he's not saying these women that he's pimping out should be in the masjid, right? Because that would be a problem.
Yeah.
That would be a problem. And I think that's what it is for me. That's what it comes down to. And for the life of me, I cannot figure out, I guess, maybe it's part of this, why there is such a fixation on these like reformed gangsters and like kind of gangster wannabes, or even maybe they are gangsters. And as you say, kind of like giving them the time of day, and not our sisters. But
Just
it's something
to
interesting. Sorry, Tanzum.
No, sorry, just to add, like, because the Dawah bros are the ones that are elevating people like Friends of Harami, so it makes you think, like, and it comes, like, they have no legs to stand on. Like, these same Dawah bros are calling out women for doing X or Y or Z, for, like, in comparison to someone that's actually pimping out women. Like, it
You
does
know,
not, like, I couldn't compute it. I was so shocked. Right, I'm like, then anything goes. Like, what are the standards they have? They're legit hypocrites in that sense, right? Like, you have no legs to stand on to question anything women do or say. If you're literally like putting someone like that on a pedestal and did not even question him or even grill him that, like, no, this is not part of the deen. You shouldn't be doing this. Like, even if you didn't have the courage to do that, and instead you're buddying up to him on the podcast, like, it
yeah,
just blows my mind, right? So I was so shocked about. Actually, I wasn't, like, I was shocked in the sense that I didn't know this guy was actually that kind of person until like a year or two later.
crazy.
But these are the kind of people that are cozying up to, the Dawah bros are cozying up to, unfortunately, right? So, and then on top of that, like, going back to your point about people that are like women that are in situations or coerced into situations. In the case of Frenzo, I don't think he's coercing people, because he gloats
No,
about
it's
that
not.
women come to him, right? Like, women come to him and this and that, like, whatever. He can do what he wants, but like in our tradition, like, and this, when I went through my sort of personal reformation in the sense of how I perceive things, and how, I guess Islam truly tells us to perceive it, like, the Olia, and I've read many countless stories, and that kind of changed my perspective where it comes to women that are in prostitution, where the Olia knew about these communities, knew about the struggles, are very closely tied in the communities, in the sense that they knew what they were going through their personalities or backgrounds or whatever it may be. And then they tried to actually help, like you just touched on it, Habib, but I also read countless stories about how they're like, oh, look, we will start a business for these people that are in prostitution, so that they can leave prostitution behind and do business. Because what's at the core of it, obviously, economic situations, and situations that they feel like that they desperately have to. They're so desperate that they have to kind of partake in this situation, right? Especially when these people might have, maybe single family or whatever it may be. And so when I heard these stories, that Olia aren't like morally judging them and saying, look at these people, leave them, they're bad. Instead, they're actually going out of the way to be like sacrificing their own time, money, and effort to be like, look, I think there's an awliya that I read that made like a clothing business in their behalf, like sewing and got them all involved so that they can kind of lead that. Like all this sort of stuff, it makes you think like, what are we actually doing in the community to help these people rather than like all we're doing is just morally judging them and then just leaving them to be. But like, and then subhanAllah, like I have a really close friend, actually, one of my best friends. He is Muslim as well. He sort of not anymore, but he used to work as like a counselor, I think. So he would be talking to all sorts of people, like people that went to jail, people that need help mentally, and wanted to talk to someone. He was the guy that they reach out to, and he actually talked to people who are prostitutes, and so he actually learned from their conversations what they were going through, and he kind of shared some learnings that he took from that, like where they came from overseas, for example, or that like they're literally buying, like they didn't have any lifestyle. I'm not saying they were Muslim or non-Muslim, but the point is there's a lot more happening that we need to be aware of and then address those issues. But we don't get to that point. Like we don't get to that part at all. We sort of cut it off at like, oh, they're bad people and morally judge them, and then we don't give them any sort of husnul done in that sense, right? And unfortunately, like it's very lacking in that community. But then there's that weird perception where you're talking about, Habeeb, as well, where it's like, but men will like I don't know, seek them out, or even like when it comes to following these models on Instagram or whatever it may be, like are seeking all this behavior at the same time. So they'll fulfill in the from the nafs perspective, but then morally they'll think that they're better than them, which doesn't really, it's like I don't know what that is, you know what I mean?
It's a big cognitive dissonance. And also, can I just share, I loved what you were saying about how many of the awliya and the scholars of the past, how they saw trying to alleviate the condition that many female prostitutes that were in. And it just reminds me of two hadiths, and I was sharing a personal story where the two hadiths, and again, these are hadiths that when you reflect upon, and I'm sure you've probably heard of them, like the first one, the story of Al-Kifl, who was known to, a person of the people of the past, the Prophet mentioned, he committed many sins, whether it's scholars mention like drinking, fornication, or what have you, right? And then he saw a woman and he thought she was a prostitute. So he offered her money to sleep with him. And then when she came to his apartment, and just when he was about to enter her, he noticed that she was starting to cry and started to shake. And he asked her, like, have I forced you? What's wrong? And she said, I've never done this before. It's just out of poverty, out of like need. And then he felt empathy for her. And he said, take the money and leave. You don't need to do this act. And then he repented to Allah that same day, and then he died the same day. And then Allah got maybe like an angel to inscribe on the door that Allah has forgiven Al-Kifl. But that story, a lot of people talk about the forgiveness of Allah forgave Al-Kifl for his act of tawbah. But look, even that he was doing committing a lot of sins, he still saw the humanity in this woman. And what's prevented him from continuing was because that he knew that she was doing it out of poverty. Like she didn't want to do it. So she was effectively being coerced. Did you understand? Not coerced, but she didn't want to do it. So that's why he's like, take the money, it's okay. And there's another hadith, which I'm sure many people have heard, which just reflects upon this hadith. And this is a Prophet, peace be upon him, teaching us. The hadith of Tawassul, the 3 men that were trapped in a cave, that were walking somewhere, they got trapped in a cave. One of the men, he said that there was a woman that he knew and he loved and he wanted to be with her, but she didn't want to be with him. So he then offered her money and said, if I give you money, would you be with me? And only again out of dire need, because she was in need financially, she agreed to sleep with him. And just when he was about to penetrate her, she told him to fear Allah and don't break this seal, meaning it was a euphemism for don't break the hymen, don't penetrate me until you accept with the right haqq, in terms of, unless you do it in a dignified way, i.e. you marry me, not just to sleep with me. And then he felt remorse for her. And again, he told her to take the money, and he asked for repentance. He sought forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and some of the rock was moved. But again, these are hadiths that the Prophet is teaching us about sexual ethics as well. People lose sight of this. So maybe they just focus on the male narrative, but the Prophet is also teaching us about, like the other hadith where the Prophet asked the companions, what do you say about zina? And they said, Allah and His Messenger said it's prohibited until the Day of Judgment. This is reported in Adab al-Mufrad by Imam Bukhari. And then the Prophet said, do you know that if a man were to commit zina with 10 women, is lesser of a sin than if he were to commit zina with his neighbor's wife? Meaning if he were to sleep with his neighbor's wife. Why? Because again, it's teaching you that because everyone will say zina is haram. We know it's haram, but you sleeping with your neighbor's wife is worse in terms of ethically, clearly, because that's a trust that you even breaching. It's worse than sleeping with 10 prostitutes. That's what the scholars say. Does that make sense? Again, it's not to justify in saying it's better to sleep with 10 prostitutes than to sleep with your neighbor's wife. But again, this is the Prophet teaching ethics and humanity to the companions that for every reason people lose sight of. And just a quick short anecdote that I will share is that when I went to Brazil, this was in 2016 or 17, I went on a holiday and I was in Copacabana. This is a true story. And I heard someone say, Habeeb. So I turned around. So my name is Habeeb. And then there's this Brazilian woman. She wasn't, well, she's in Brazil. So she went short skirt, what have you. And she said, Ta'al. And I was like, oh, she speaks Arabic, but she's Brazilian looking, like mixed race. And I said, Takalam Arabiya. And she said, and she started speaking Arabic to me. And I said, how do you know Arabic? She said, oh, I know to speak Arabic. She's speaking Arabic. And then I said, because I was there making a documentary. I was at the time trying to make a documentary with BBC Brazil after my book came out. And then she was like, oh, come to my place. And then I realized, oh, she was a working girl. She was a prostitute. I said, no, I'm not here for that. And then she was like, what are you here for? I said, I'm doing a documentary. I'm trying to find out about the Black experience and the Muslims in Brazil, this and the other. And then she said, I've got a lot to tell you about that because I know of Muslims. That's how I picked up Arabic. No word of a lie. I'm not even laughing. It's just crazy. She learned Arabic from an imam who was one of her clients. And then 2 years later, she actually embraced Islam. And she's even writing a book about this. So she had a number of clients, and I interviewed her for one of the documents, hasn't been released yet, but she spoke about how even a number of her clients, Muslim, some of them African, very aggressive. She said they would want to sleep without condoms. She said, I don't know why, they're very animalistic. They're not like the other clients. And I was like, subhanAllah. There's one thing, of course, obviously, sleeping with prostitutes is haram, we know that. But then she said like they know humanity, but it said one of her clients, the imam, was teaching her and he would pray sometimes before sleeping with her. She was intrigued about, oh, what is this? And she, I believe in the one God. Then she learned about Islam, and 2 years later she became Muslim. So this is like, it's a true story, but it's something that on so many levels, it's just like this way Nadeem is shaking his head, because it's crazy that even the reputation, the image that Muslims have, being very aggressive with women, even that is a problem. Not all Muslims, but that is even a perception that some Muslims, some not even non-Muslims have, that they be like, I've dated Muslim guys for every reason, they just want anal sex. I've heard that a number of times. And it's just like, that should be the one thing that, even if anything, Muslims are not doing. There's one thing committing zina, but then you've got this fascination and obsession with anal sex, which is haram upon haram. Do you understand what I'm getting at? And then also there are in some communities, which without saying any names, because there's this obsession with female virginity and having the intact hymen, you're having Muslims who will have anal sex to preserve the woman's hymen because they think that at least I'm preserving for her. And there was a clip of a brother from a podcast I'm not going to name. He said, yeah, like what's for behind is for me, what's for front is for her husband. So I'll just have behind, I'll enjoy her. And then for front, I'll leave that. So when she gets married, that's what she can do. And because I volunteered at a sexual health clinic, I saw a number of these like women being torn, like having rips, and because the women, a lot of them, obviously it's consensual, but they're still doing it because they want to appease their boyfriend, right? Or some of them, they want to preserve their quote unquote virginity. So this is also part of the education that Muslims need to understand, that, again, we're not talking about halal and haram, they know it's haram, but you having anal intercourse is even more risky and dangerous than even you having vaginal intercourse. But for them, they're obviously thinking so much about having an intact hymen. They're not even thinking about the risks, the STI risk, and the other complications that can happen from anal intercourse. So these are some of like the issues, the real life issues that people need to be educated and to be aware of, because in their mind, they're looking at like, I'm still a virgin because no one's touched my front. And Shireen El-Feki, who's a British, a Welsh writer, she wrote the book Sex in the City, and she about the sexual life of Arabs and like Muslims in the modern world. And she spoke to one famous incident. She spoke to some prostitutes in North Africa, and the women said, no, I'm still a virgin because I only do anal and oral. So again, even this understanding, there are some people who have that understanding that, again, not to criticize, I'm just trying to help people understand the mentality that some people's, again, as long as I'm not having intercourse in the front part, it's fine, everything else goes, or it's lesser of a sin. Or that's why you will find, like you mentioned, Brother Nadeem, about there'll be brothers who'll be selling like drugs, but they'll be reading very complex aqeedah books. Like this is a long time ago, before I was like really kind of serious on the deen, there'll be brothers who'll be like, we can do frauds. I'm laughing because it's just absurd. Like you can defraud non-Muslims, but if it's a Muslim, you can't defraud them. So if you get a bank statement of a non-Muslim, you can do it, but if it's a Muslim, you can't do it. Or if it's a Muslim, to look at their name, if they've got a certain name, meaning they don't follow a certain sects, but they will look very religious, very practicing the thobe and everything, and it's just like, and that's why I was always like, what is this? Like, obviously I was Muslim, but I just didn't understand this. Like, what is this? And there's some people that have these belief systems, and they're able to, I don't know how, but they're able to justify and
So I know you mentioned this point a bit earlier on about protective jealousy, Habib, and as I was saying, I'd never ever that translation never ever sat right with me, just because of not because of, well, yeah, yes, it's usage in the Dawah bros, and they're kind of like how they're using it, but also the jealousy connotation, right? And it seems to me that it's used a lot. I don't know if this is your experience, but to me, it's used a lot in a way that is you're coercively controlling your wife, right, or your sister, or your female, family member, right? And ghayrah in itself actually is such a beautiful concept, and I don't think people realize how beautiful it is, because they just protective jealousy. You're within your right to ban your wife to do this because of ghayrah. But it's such a beautiful concept in that hadith when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentions it. Of course, it's beautiful because it's from him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so I was working on a translation of ghayrah, and like it's such a difficult, because we don't really have a cognate in English. We don't really have a translation for it in English. But eventually, I arrived on the translation that I think works well to demonstrate kind of the broadness of what it is, because it talks. You can kind of have honor, protecting your boundaries, kind of being aware of your boundaries. I think is probably a good way to kind of phrase it. And the translation I eventually arrived at was loving guardianship. So it's with love. It's not coercive. You're aware of what your honor is and where your boundaries are, and you're doing it through love rather than kind of coercively, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to add before I say anything?
Yeah. So the point about that, it's crazy because what it reminds me, and unfortunately we see this a lot, is obviously the most common language spoken is English, and obviously a lot of Muslims speak English, especially in the West. So they use translations from certain terminologies in Arabic they use the English translation to try to understand the Arabic. Does that make sense? And that's probably not the right way to do. We should learn Arabic for what it is and learn the term for what it is, and then kind of do our best to interpret it. But some things are given, like the point you said about protective jealousy and ghayrah. The same thing I see it all the time, even when it comes to conversations in the manosphere, or it comes to understanding male or females' innate disposition. Like the word fitrah gets always used and thrown around. Like, this is in the women's fitrah, this is in the male's fitrah, and it gets synonymously used with like someone's innate disposition. But what the terminology fitrah in of itself, what it is, like we don't actually know. Like it's not a conceived thing, like in the sense of we talk about the heart, right? Like we know what it is, it's observable. But the fitrah in of itself, what it is, there's question marks around it. It's not like we have that sense. Like we don't know, for example, like we know aspects about Allah's mercy and compassion, but Allah in essence we don't know, right? Because we are limited in Him, and in the sense of fitrah can be talked about in that sense. And so people kind of just include it in conversations when it comes to like desires or innate disposition, like, oh no, it's in the women's fitrah to be like, they're meant to be, I don't know, soft spoken and obeying the husband because it's in their fitrah. But it's like, wait a minute, like you've done a lot of things here. You've just assumed what fitrah means. You've just, by using Islamic language conveniently, you've just assumed this is how women should be. But in reality, they sort of have these assumptions about women and how they should be without having a degree in psychology, without having a deeper understanding to those layers of female, I don't know, psychology. But then they're sort of making these assumptions, I don't know from where, back projecting onto Islam using Islamic language like fitrah, and then coming to these conclusions. Whereas in reality, and shout out to Nadim's. We have a mutual friend, me and Nadim, like Saadi. He's the one that kind of talks about it. And then I sort of looked into it. I'm like, he has actually a fair point, because Dawah bros kind of use it willy nilly to justify certain things and certain behaviors. Like it's in the male's fitrah to be polygamous, and therefore that's why polygamy is in Islam or something like that. And then it kind of connected to Andrew Tate, right? And then women, it's not in their fitrah to be like this. Why are they like this? But it's kind of dangerous, because you subconsciously portray as if you're speaking from Islamic perspective just because you're using these Arabic words, but in reality, that's not how the word was meant to be used. But because we can just, I'd rather respect someone to just be like, no, this is my assumption of how women's dispositions should be or are. I'm like, okay, but at least you're not using Islamic language to justify your sort of preconceived notions of, I don't know, women's disposition. Does that make sense? So there's that common trend, unfortunately.
Yeah, no.
Can I just one thing before you go? About one thing, just about the ghayrah again, quickly. The hadith that I translated specifically mentions ghayrah when there is cause as well. So it's not just like you're always on alert for ghayrah, like you're always kind of like on edge. Wallahu alam, I don't know about other hadith that use that term, but that hadith specifically mentions ghayrah with cause. So I thought I'd just mention that.
Is that the hadith in relation to how ghayrah was used when the Prophet, peace be upon him, was referring to the incident with Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas?
That I don't know,
saw his wife. Okay, so I love what both of you are saying. I want to I'll expand upon that and just share my thoughts.
Quickly, sorry, with the fitrah point, like fitrah in of itself, if you look at the definitions, inclining towards Allah, loving truth, and accepting tawheed. Like it's very specific. Does that make sense? Okay. So, but it gets used in like talking about psychology, like you know what I mean? So,
yes. So this is what. So if we could talk about the ghayrah point, I was going to say protective jealousy, but I don't want Nadim to be upset with me. And then we go into the fitrah point. So with ghayrah, the funny thing is, I remember years ago it was always just translated as just jealousy. Then protective jealousy was, and I thought, okay, protective jealousy, I don't mind that. Now, one of the challenges, and I think love and guardianship, what you've used, is a better translation and more in line with the Islamic understanding. The challenge I have with those types of translations is that you can lose a lot of people, like the average person, if that makes sense. Because in a way, sometimes you need to speak to people. Again, I'm referring to English-speaking people. If you say love and guardianship, people don't know what that means. Or they might not really understand how that works in terms of a relationship. But if you say jealousy, unfortunately, I do agree with you. It does have a negative connotation, but people understand what it is. But then you can still explain, as the hadith mentions, there's ghayrah which is good and ghayrah which is like not good if there's no suspicion. Do you understand? And I think even people could understand that having a healthy amount of jealousy is good. The same way like a woman has healthy jealousy over her husband, likewise a man can have healthy jealousy over his wife. The problem is in certain communities that it has a negative connotation. The same way, like my friend, what was that? You might have to pronounce it, because I don't want to butcher he says, is it Izzah in Urdu for honor?
Izzah, yeah.
That's got a certain connotation in Urdu or Desi culture that might come across as toxic for some people in this day and age. But I don't think the origin is toxic. It's similar to like ghayrah or ghayrah. Do you understand what I'm getting at? So this is where even like the word haya, that's translated as shame, bashfulness, modesty, and in the Islamic understanding encompasses all of this, or even self-restraint. Like even when I've translated in certain hadiths, I've translated as in self-restraint, because shame nowadays has got a negative connotation. But essentially, it does have like the hadith that if you've got no haya, do what you wish, meaning if you've got no shame. In English, up until maybe like I say the 90s, people understood that. Now, if you say shame, people think shame is just bad. But I would argue, even from an Islamic perspective, to have shame is a good thing. But the word shame has got a negative connotation. But then if you were to use a word like bashfulness, it won't hit home. Some people don't know what bashfulness. I'm talking the everyday average person. If you were to say modesty, like we spoke about earlier, a lot of people unfortunately just attribute to that to women. The same way, if we were to say, like a lot of people nowadays will talk about chastity, that's a very old English word. It doesn't resonate with, especially it doesn't resonate in for a lot of people nowadays, especially a lot of men. That's why I prefer to use sexual discipline, because having sexual discipline is someone like the story of in Prophet Yusuf in 12 chapters of Quran. Allah mentions that she desired him. وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَن رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. He would have desired her if he didn't see the sign from his Lord. And when the scholars, they speak about that, they say even that sentence, it refutes some of the Christians who were saying, hashily, like that Prophet Joseph didn't have capacity to have intimate relations with women. It's refuting that because Allah has mentioned she desired him and he would have desired her, meaning he doesn't have the capacity to have intimate relations. He would have desired it, but if he didn't see the sign of his Lord. So that's also indicating that having desire for something or having the ability to do something but not doing something out of fear of Allah or for the sake of Allah, that's not the same as someone who doesn't have the capacity to do something but doesn't do it. It's a high maqam if you've got the capacity to do something, but you choose not to. So that's why I like to use the term like sexual discipline, especially when I'm speaking to men, because I think men generally understand and gravitate towards discipline. Whereas if I were to say chastity, it just sounds very archaic and maybe again, for a lot of men, it maybe doesn't resonate as much. But they're all saying, and that's one of the challenges of translation. So and I probably will start trying using the love and guardianship, because I do agree it's a better translation. But I think for a lot of people, they don't even know what that means. Whereas jealousy, at least they know what it means, and then you can reframe them or educate them in terms of what you're talking about. Similar to like when Tanzim was talking about fitrah, I do agree with you. A lot of people abuse that term, that they use it in a sense of psychology. Like you said, it's a woman's natural state. They'll say it's a woman's fitrah, it's a man's fitrah to be polygynous. It's a woman's fitrah to stay at home. But like you mentioned, if we're speaking from an Islamic perspective, especially given that when we're talking about the soul, Allah mentions that we've only been given little knowledge. So we can only speak about the soul or the unseen, what Allah and His Messenger have said. So fitrah, Allah, the Prophet, peace be upon him, another hadith, he speaks about the different parts of what's part of the fitrah, like cutting your nails, circumcision. So that we can say is part of the fitrah, because the Prophet said that it's in the hadith. Things like man is polygynous by nature, we have to be very careful saying that's the fitrah. So I do agree with you. That's where people will use fitrah as like, oh, psychology, it's your innate. But again, it's when you use Islamic terms, it gives you like credibility amongst Muslims. That's why. But I do think it's definitely problematic. But I've always been struggling with things like that, because do you use, like what you were saying, Nadeem, like the more appropriate translation, but then it might go above a lot of people's heads. That's what I've noticed. But then if you use like the common denominator, everyone understands. But then I think then it's about educating and expanding the understanding that jealousy might have a negative connotation, but it doesn't have a negative connotation in Islam. And this is what, when we're speaking about jealousy within an Islamic framework or ghayrah, this is what it means. Do you understand what I mean? So that's where that's also one of the challenges of language, because you have your intended meaning, and then the person who's listening, they have a meaning that they might think what you mean, and that might not be your intended meaning. And that's why there will be, in so many matters, even in relation to Islamic law, difference of opinion. Like the famous hadith of when the Prophet told the people, the companions, do not pray Asr until you reach Banu Qurayza. That was interpreted differently. Did the Prophet mean it literally, or did he mean it like hurry up? So that's why the companions, they took two different opinions, because it could mean two different things, and the Prophet didn't rebuke either one of them. So again, that's also one of the beauties, and again, the more people understand and appreciate like the subtleties of language, we have that in English language as well. It's not just Arabic. Like if a man were to say he met a woman and he spent the night at her place, what does that mean? Oh, he slept with her. He didn't say that. He didn't say that. And that's why you have to be careful. So if a man said, I met such Sarah and I spent the night at her place, then this second man who heard that story goes and tells another man, oh, this person had intercourse with this woman. You've added that. He didn't say that. But that's the nature of language. And especially when we're speaking about Islamic law, especially when it comes to obviously no one's here implementing punishments, but that's why you need to be precise. Like with the famous hadith of Ma'iz, the companion, when he went to the Prophet to say that he committed adultery, and the Prophet was turning away and trying to make excuses for him. Maybe you kissed her, maybe, and he said, "No, I committed adultery." Then the Prophet was said, "Do you know what you're saying?" He said, "Yeah, I committed zina." And then the Prophet asked people, "Is he insane? Is something wrong with him?" Again, trying to make excuses because he doesn't want to implement the had punishment. Then the Prophet explicitly said, "Aniktaha," meaning, did you penetrate her? Because he wants to know, do you understand what you're saying? And that's where, again, when it comes to same way like court of law, there's some things you need to be explicit and but I think also for many of us nowadays, we don't we use a lot of euphemisms, sometimes obviously for good reasons when it comes to intimate matters, but when it comes to the deen, sometimes you need to be very clear. Like Ramadan, a lot of people say, as Muslims we abstain from food and drink. No, food, drink and intercourse. And you have to be quite clear, not food, drink and intimacy, or having relations with your spouse or conjugal, because when you say those terms, they are ambiguous, and people can, so intimacy meaning you're not allowed to kiss your wife, you're not allowed to hug her. Because if you say intimacy, that's what it can indicate. Do you understand what I mean? So this is where, if the person knows what you mean, you can use a euphemism. But where people might not know what you mean, that's where sometimes you might need to be explicit, not explicit in a vulgar sense, but it's clear what people do you understand? And that's where I think, as for Muslims, how to get us to understand, especially when we're talking about sensitive topics like sex and intimacy, there are some things, especially when it comes to fasting, people need to understand what is prohibited. It's sexual intercourse. It's not kissing. Do you understand? So it's just so people know, because a lot of Muslims aren't even aware of that. And that's where, because there are a number of like grey areas or euphemisms that people use, they might think, like there was one brother, he said that he thought that touching or being around a woman would invalidate your fast. Do you understand? So this is where sometimes we might laugh at it and think, how can you think that? Because he also came from a background, studied the Shafi'i madhab as well, and their interpretation, if you touch a woman, invalidates your fast, and that's a legitimate and valid opinion. I'm not
Is
going to
there
say
a
it's wrong.
hadith? Sorry, whilst you're on this topic, that Prophet said to a young couple to not kiss as you're fasting, and then to another older couple said you can kiss. And then someone asked, like, why did you give different rulings about the same thing to different people? And the Prophet said that, with the younger couple, they're more likely to go to, intercourse. So therefore, kind of prohibited the kissing, as opposed to older generation. They're not going to have those urges if they kiss. Am I quoting something correct here, or am I?
No, what you said is correct, 100%. But the Prophet gave the explanation. Like you said, so when the first person came, the younger man, he told him, no, you can't kiss your wife because, and he explained after the reason why. Does that make sense? But I'm saying as a default, kissing doesn't nullify your fast.
I brought that example in the context of like that legalese, right? Like there's a hikmah to that ruling in that certain period of time. And whereas, if you compare it to like the Dawah, bro, sometimes like they try to bend rules in a certain way for their own desires. But then you can see here clearly that, the rules and the Prophet's advice was as per, to not, kind of go in a certain direction, which is obviously the, sexual intercourse. So some people might kind of, it just kind of depends on situation to situation. I guess our deen is nuanced like that, right?
And this is where, like, perfect. This is when nuance exactly is important. But a lot of Muslims, they're not receiving that level of education. It's just black and white. So that's why there's some things, there's nuance. But then some people, unfortunately, if they're unethical, if they're immoral, they will exploit these things. That's why there's some people who say, like we spoke about, certain individuals who have maybe cognitive dissonance or a warped idea that I can do everything with a woman as long as even anal intercourse, but it's not zina. So therefore, it's a minor sin. It's wrong, but it's not as bad as zina. Do you understand? So there's some Muslims who, I can rob, I can do this, but as long as it's a non-Muslim, because I'm in the Dawah Harb, the land of non-Muslims, then it's not as bad as. Do you understand? And this is a problem. So you can understand the rules, but if you don't understand the ethical principles of the Sharia as well, you will be like the people of the past that Allah condemned. The people that were told, don't work on Saturday, and then they go on Friday, throw their tent, come on a Sunday and take their tent with their fish and say, well, technically we didn't work on Saturday. And technically, yes, they didn't work on Saturday, but again, you know what you're intended to do. You're trying to find legal loopholes. And that's where a lot of, like, you could say, people that have studied, the legality and the rules, but then also you have to understand, you have to tie it in with the ethics and the morals and the principles that I would say that the average or the everyday person has and understands, even if they haven't studied. Non-Muslim and Muslim people know what's right, what's wrong, and that's what ultimately, when you think about the Prophet, peace be upon him, and the companions in particular, what, like, I was reflecting on, like, even about, you know, what you was asking or talking about masculinity, and I thought about this before. What characteristics, if any, would you say that they all had even prior to Islam? If I were to think of one, it's not a trick question. If I were to think of one, like, what characteristic do they all have during Islam and even before they were Muslim? Integrity. They were all people of integrity. And this is something that the Prophet, peace be upon him, of course, was described as Al-Amin, a trustworthy person, someone not deceitful, someone that doesn't lie. Umar bin Khattab was known for that. Khalid bin Walid was known for that prior to Islam. They were, if they said they wanted to do something or believe something, they will do it, or they will say it. They weren't deceitful. They weren't people that were like two-faced. This is a trait that even when someone asks, when the Prophet explained that a believer can be a coward, a miser, but he can never be a liar. That's not something that's like having faith and lying and, you know, twisting. That's not something that's from our deen. So when you think about a characteristic of Islam or Muslims, men in particular as well, yes, it's obviously high, and that's part of Iman as well, of course, but integrity, to be people of truth. Not that we're saints, we don't commit any sin. We commit sin, we do wrong, we fall, we slip. But to be people who like are two-faced, who say one thing but they mean something else, that's something that non-Muslims, no one would respect such a person. But that's something that when you look and read the lives of the companions, that's something that they all had even prior to Islam, that they were still respected individuals. Even if their aqeedah was wrong prior to Islam and they worshipped the X, Y, and Z, even if they did certain things like burying, there were people of integrity. And that's why even when you read their stories, there's so much truth and like the vulnerability, the honesty, that you're thinking, wow, they admitted this. Whereas, you know, I'm saying we as collectively as Muslims, I think we're losing that. And that's something that if as a community, that is what we should be known by from non-Muslims as well. Not our women wear hijab, we've got long beards, or, well, some of us, like I said, still struggling on that side, whatever. But that's what we should be known for, not just the rituals. You know, we pray 5 times a day. This is something that is a defining quality, not only of Islam, but all righteous people that non-Muslim people could recognize. And that's something that, again, I think we need to revive, and that should be like a cornerstone of what it means to be not only a man, a Muslim, a human being that I think will get the respect of others as well. But Allah knows best. But that's something that, again, I've always really been thinking about, because, again, especially when you talk about masculinity and this, that, and the other, what is a characteristic or trait that the people of the past had, and it goes across generations. It's not because someone is more knowledgeable, because people equate knowledge with piety, and that's incorrect. That the more knowledgeable you are, the more pious and the more righteous and closer you are to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not the case. Because there are some people that we know of, I'm sure, in our family or a different generation, who didn't know Arabic, didn't know all of these books and such, but they had Iman. So you can't tie religious studies or level of religious education to piety. The same way there's people that, I maybe show my age, in the 90s that were obsessed with aqeedah and studying aqeedah, this and the other, but it doesn't mean they had the Iman of, what was it? Was it Al-Ghazali or Ibn Taymiyyah mentioned, like an old grandmother? That sometimes when you study too much aqeedah, and again, aqeedah is not the same as Iman. It's not the same. Don't mix up the two. Like, you can study aqeedah, it doesn't mean that it will necessarily increase your faith. And I'm saying that's something that we sometimes lose sight of. The same way studying a lot of fiqh, it can make you thick. I use that as that's supposed to be like a joke. You're supposed to smile at that one. Too much thick can make you thick. Tanzim just looking at me like, what am I saying? But the thing is, too much thick can make you thick.
I've got so many, like, you touched on a beautiful point, like, regarding there's this assumption where there's people that present themselves, you know, big bearded, mashallah, very learned and study the deen so much, and they're, you know, beautiful speakers, and they can articulate the tradition ways that I could only dream of, and they're on stage and speaking about things. And my advice to people when they talk about, oh, like, you know, look at this person, look at that person, I'm like, I know it's probably not the most ideal, because obviously Islamically we should you know, have husna done for everyone, but in that sense, for one's safety, I'd always recommend, like, look, be a bit suspicious, be a bit skeptical, purely because as myself, who like alhamdulillah, through doing the podcast and stuff like that, sometimes I might get, asked to speak somewhere or get told to, like even recently, doing a speech at someone's wedding, and you get these opportunities where you're up on stage talking about Islam, or whatever it is, right? And I know for myself in my heart, like how it can fuel the ego, right? Like when you're up on stage, you're getting this intention. People are coming to you asking these questions, right? And I'm not even anyone like student of knowledge in that sense, but just because maybe people have seen me in my face, like people kind of put you on a pedestal automatically, and makes you feel good, like you know what I mean? Like it's normal, it's a human behavior, but I guess it's always important that whoever is in that position, that they sort of recognize it, and they have to humble themselves and try to do that work, or else you'll be going high and high and high, and people take advantage. So when I know that I feel that myself, then I look at people who are on stage who have like millions of more followers than I ever do, right? Or I know that they're battling on it like 1,000, 10,000 times worse than me, you know what I mean? And so for me, it's like, I don't know if they've done that spiritual training in order to keep them humble, right? Like if it's a facade, right? And on top of that, obviously, when it comes to, I know we touched on this on the last episode, where people who go study and this and that, a lot of people that are really good at doing that, it's because it's natural to them, because their natural disposition is to be book smart and to get into the books and read this and that, debate, argue about whatever topics and articulate them. Like they enjoy doing that. That's who they are. So kind of propping them up because of doing something that they're probably already good at, which is studying and deen and whatnot. Like it's not something to really acknowledge someone by. I think there's the hikmah aspect that needs to be highlighted, where that's the important piece to the puzzle, right? Like Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, like Allah granted him hikmah. Like it's not like Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam had the time to hit the fiqh books and study this and that. There's a level of hikmah that needs to be accompanied with that learning, right? And that's what I sort of look for. So when I come and talk to someone maybe who they might not know me, and then I talk about certain topics which I know I've vetted with other students of knowledge, I know that I'm not wrong, but they may have not heard about these kind of topics. I sort of I'm very inquisitive of how they react, because I've seen a lot of people that are very like strict and be like, no, that's wrong and this and that, and I already know that they didn't do the psychological training to understand where I'm coming from, even though I try to say it the best I can. But when I do meet someone that I can see they're thinking about it, they're considering it, they're asking the right questions, and it's like, okay, this guy, he's a true student of knowledge, because he's applying hikmah to the situation and trying to navigate and understand what's happening. So I think there's a lot to say on that aspect, where we can't just assume someone that's just knowledgeable on stage speaking is just pure awliya kind of mindset. We should like be a bit more skeptical. But touching on your point about masculinity, I know we've touched on it, but it would be good to kind of go a bit deeper on that point, because when it comes to like spiritual transformation, I mean, connected to the point I just made, and why that kind of hits home for me, because actually yesterday me and my brother-in-law, we go archery pretty regularly, and I know I've spoken to Nadeem a bit about this recently, and this ties in, and I've gone into archery a lot because of, I guess, the Islamic masculinity side. So I'm learning currently, I've been doing it for I think 3-4 months now, learning Ottoman style archery. So it's obviously connected to the tradition, and so a lot of things I've learned along the way is like, the way that we are meant to do archery is connected to our prayer. The spirituality is there within that archery, that it's meant to reform you as a person, as a human being. And this is transformative process that goes on. So like one of the aspects about archery is that you have to master short distance archery. So short distance meaning the size of the bow is the distance that you have to be away from the board that you're aiming at. So it's really close, right? So it's probably like 1 meter, let's just say, right? And so every time me and my brother-in-law are shooting in front of, let's just say, friends or family friends, I always hear the same question, right? It's always like me and him have to defend, like, why are you shooting so close? Why are you shooting so close? And, it's such a strange concept. And me and my brother-in-law, we always talk about it. It's like, it's so interesting that like, there's always that question. And I wonder where it comes from. Like, maybe it's because they've always seen archery in a certain way. They've always, perceived it a certain way. And so when they see something like that, it's different. Or maybe it's because, they don't see it as anything worth it. Like, you're shooting so close. Like, what's the point? Like, it should be from far. And we sort of talk about, I'm not saying I know the reason, but it's just interesting to unpack all of it. But I think a lot of us, we sort of understood is that I think people of the same personality type seem to question that aspect. Because for them, it's like, oh, look, we should be doing it from long, or maybe they are experts in, I don't know, shooting, and for them, it's like a cool thing. So archery from a long distance is the way. But if you actually follow the Ottoman style archery and the spiritual training attached to archery, you're actually learning to master. So basically, to get to the next stage of shooting from long range, you have to master the short distance. And mastering is basically you have to hit 9 bullseyes in a row from short distance. And that's very difficult. So you have to hit it 3 times in 3 different areas. And then you have to also learn to shoot with your left side, so right side and left side, accurately. And once you've mastered that and done the training, then you move on to the long distance. Does that make sense? And so that process is like, there's a lot happening there, because to get to that stage, it takes a long time. Like, to actually hit bullseyes, like 9 bullseyes in a row is not an easy feat, right? And you have to master that from a short distance. And what you learn from that, from a spiritual side, is consistency, focus, attention to detail, being truly, present in the moment, and clearing your thoughts, like not letting things outside of archery get to your mindset and trying to control your thoughts. So all these aspects, and tying it back to masculinity, is all incorporated into that activity. And therefore, that's why you need a master, because you don't want to. And the other hikmah is that you have to tame the ego, because people want to jump to long distance because of the ego. And that's the first step when it comes to when we were going through the training, is that no, like, you have to master it, in this distance, because people want to do a long distance because they want to do it for ego. So that's kind of a way to humble yourself. Like, you always have to do that because you want to learn humility, because that is essence, like what you're trying to master. You want to master as much as you can from a short distance, and people might not respect you, but there's a method to it, right? So I know I'm going in a bit of a tangent, but it's just to showcase, like, the point we were talking about, like, when it comes to masculinity, like the aspects that we don't really highlight in our communities, but then also talking about, like, the religious side. Like, we can just pray and do the actions and study and this and that, which is great and it's fine, it's needed, but we're not doing all this sort of spiritual training in the way that it should have, or in the prophetic way, because archery, horse riding, all this stuff are part of the Sunnah, right? And they're not highlighted in our day and age. Like, I, alongside archery, shout out to Archery Ascension, because I go to them. They also do horsemanship, so sakin. It's really, really, it's actually opened my eyes up, because you learn how to tame the horse. So there's wild horses, and it's a very, very admirable art that it's like lost in this day and age. And people talk about how in the Islamic tradition, like, once you know how to take care of a horse, you know how to take care of a child. So a lot of it is connected, right? So like in horsemanship, which is different to horse riding, you see a horse in the field, in the paddock, running around, and you've never met the horse before. You have to take your time to become friends with the horse, essentially. And it requires a lot of skill. You have to know the pace that they're walking at, and you have to walk at that pace. You can't be too jumpy with them. You have to be very easy. You can't, you have to do very subtle things, like you can't touch them in areas that are uncomfortable, and you don't want to, approach them from behind, because all these horses have their trauma of their own, just like humans do, right? So you have to kind of figure out what makes them tick, what doesn't, and that kind of psychological training to accommodate for that horse. And then you sort of, it takes a lot of patience, right? It takes hours, but then you become friends with that horse. And that skill is a skill, and it comes to, and we don't have that, unfortunately. But that's what I mean, like, that aspect is all missing, and people are just going off and studying, but they're not learning all this stuff. So that's what I'm, my interest is at the moment. So I know I talk for a lot, but it's just connecting to what you've mentioned as well regarding masculinity.
Is
So
that
I just
like a
wanted to
male
get your thoughts on that.
initiation? So is that like a male initiation Is that like what I think was like? Is it like Fitrah training? What you're referring to?
So
Because I've heard
I
about that.
my who I'm going to the archery session. So they're an archery range and club, but
Mhm.
they also do horsemanship. But yeah, I think it would fall under the umbrella of Islamic masculinity and futuwa. I guess like how it's talked about in our spaces currently. So yeah, it would definitely fall into that category.
Mashallah, mashallah.
Yeah, subhanAllah. So like in terms of how do you come across when it comes to observing like what we mentioned, students of knowledge, and then them studying and having these perceptions of the deen, right? But then also missing that kind of Islamic masculinity aspect, and then you see a lot of people who are going to the we talked about Andrew Tate, are falling back onto these kind of characters to inform the way that they see deen in some way. So I just wanted to get your thoughts around that topic because it would be really good to hear your thoughts.
I'm laughing. Sorry. I'm laughing because when you mentioned that, I was just thinking about back in the day what a lot of brothers, students of knowledge and non-students of knowledge, but a lot of brothers, when we used to speak about the Sunnah and masculinity, it was just about collecting multiple wives. That was a Sunnah that everyone was like obsessed with. If I'm going to be completely honest, that's a problem. That is what. So whilst everything what you said is true, and I agree, I think that's a problem because I was just thinking, and when you mentioned about the red pill and Andrew Tate, that was the mindset. That is what it is to be a man, to have not even necessarily to have a lot of money, to have a lot of women, like meaning 4 wives, 3, 4 wives. That was always what it means to be a Muslim man. Like the more a polygamous man is better than a man that's just got one man and one woman. Sorry, the more women you have, the more of a man you have, and that was again, it's a very problematic mentality and mindset. But if I'm going to be honest with you, that was what was kind of seen as what it means. That was what a lot of people was aspiring to have. And that's why now when I'm thinking about some of the things that's happened in the last few years, if you've always, even in your Islamic education, had that mindset, that's what it means to be a man, that the better the man you are, the more manly you are, naturally you have more women. Up to like 4 wives and this, that, and the other. That that was really what shapes, not the archery and horse riding and things like that. That is also just as part of the sunnah. But I think for me, when I think about masculinity and prophetic masculinity in particular, it's again being an individual of integrity and someone who's responsible. And I think I think a lot of brothers nowadays, maybe because I'm not naturally obsessed with like gym and like health and fitness. So if people will use that like the strong believer is better than the weak believer, and they'll have that plastered while they're flexing their muscles, and it's like because you naturally like gym, which is fine, or you want to look good. I'm not saying you're doing it for women or whatever. You want to look good, so they'll use the deen or the sunnah to justify their gym business or obsession with gym. But when we look at again, when I'm looking at the Prophet peace upon him and the companions as a whole, because when we speak about masculinity, we also have to remember there's different types of masculinity. Not everyone was like Umar bin Khattab. There were some companions who were, and again, I don't want to use derogatory terms. There were some who were a bit slight, but they were men. Abu Bakr wasn't of the frame of Umar bin Khattab, but he was just as strong, if not stronger. Do you understand? So this is why it's not just about the physique. Of course, you want to look good, you have broad shoulders and all the rest of it, and these physical activities that we always talk about, but it's the inner strength that I think a lot of us we lose sight of, and especially if that's tied to having a strong reliance in Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, having strong faith. Like when we talk about tawakkul, iman, and cultivate that, because when you are dealt with a fitna, like when the death of the Prophet peace be upon him, when he passed away, it was someone who, by physical appearance, was the firmest. Abu Bakr, that was the man. Do you understand? The same way when the others, after when they did the apostasy, it was again Abu Bakr that stand firm. Now, when you compare his appearance, how he was described to Umar, for example, he was slighter and smaller, but he was stronger than him. Does that make sense? And not to, of course, disparage Umar bin Khattab, or I think it's Ibn Abbas that one of the companions had very like weak or small legs, and people when he was climbing people, and his part of his izar was risen, and people were laughing at his. And the Prophet peace be upon him said that something along the lines of his calf is equivalent to like the Mount Uhud. So again, I'm saying this to say that these were men, but not all, when we talk about men and masculinity, not just because they looked the part, so to speak. And I think that's something that, whether it is by the physique or doing these exertive exercises like horse riding, and again, I'm not saying that it's not right, or do you understand? I'm just thinking about the inner work that I think is just as important. There's not much talk done about that, and that's where maybe because, like you mentioned earlier, about the lack of tarbiyah with you, people are studying, but they're not developing the akhlaq. They're not perfecting the akhlaq. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said he was sent to teach, to perfect akhlaq, character. So for me, that is what it means to be a man. And that's something that, to be honest, or to have a good reputation. Like, what's that saying that Warren Buffett said that? It's one of my favorite quotes. He said that it takes 20 years to build a good reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it, or 5 seconds. Like, when we're talking about whether it's sex, whether it's discipline, whether it's reputation, whether it's being known to be a trustworthy person, this is something you don't get overnight. This is something that, even if anything, people will see the fruits of that when you're tested, and that comes usually later on. But the groundwork that you're doing, a lot of people might not appreciate, even you might not appreciate, but that's also part of like masculinity, or being a person of integrity, being a person of principles, that when something does happen, you can speak out about it confidently and openly, because you've been cultivated that in your heart and your soul for a number of years. Does that make sense? I just think that a lot of one of my kind of concerns, I think sometimes Muslims are being attracted to like the performative masculinity, because when people will talk about, which you mentioned again earlier, about empathy, emotional intelligence, let's be honest, that doesn't sell with Muslim men. If you're going to say let's develop empathy for women, or let's develop emotional intelligence, that is not going to sell. That's not going to work. You're going to have, so it's like you need to show things that people was like from here to here. So I didn't know how to ride the horse. Now I know how to ride the horse. Now I'm looking. So, and although these are all well and good, that in and of itself, if you're not going to be, if you've got the physique and the ability to ride the horses and to do archery, but when it comes to actually doing something, you're a coward. You're not really good. That's all for sure. Do you know what I mean? So this is where I think sometimes again we lose sight of the theatrics of what it means to be a man, and the inner work. I think sometimes and I'm speaking personally, we lose sight of that. And that's why I'm trying, how do you get that happy medium? And again, not just speaking about, oh, traditionally this how it was done. How do we try and create that in this day and age where men are being known for men of virtue, and not that you to testify for yourself, other people have to recognize it, and only recognize it when things happen that you step up. But when things happen, if you don't step up, if you're not speaking out, if you're not really doing what being a protector, a provider, and again, the people that are going to say who's a protector, provider is the one that's been provided for. It's not the man saying I'm a provider. Like, you can say I'm a protector, I'm a provider. It's the person it's the people that you're protecting, those that feel safe by your presence or by your actions. They're the ones that can validate and say that this is a person that I felt safe by what he did or what. Do you understand? And I'm still struggling in terms of how to, unless you've seen it kind of thing, how do you teach it for someone who hasn't seen it? So for example, if you've grown up with strong male role models, whether it's your father or other male figures who were working, were honest, so you've seen what it is to be a man, you don't need a course to teach you how to be a husband or to be a father. Do you understand? But unfortunately, there are a number of people in our community, both in the UK and in Australia, as well as in America, that have not seen those positive role models. So they do need to be taught. So again, that's why I'm struggling, because I've seen from my father how he conducts himself, what is to be a man. That's why maybe when I saw certain figures, I never bought into it, because I can see that's fake or performative masculinity. But I'm just thinking, for those men, and there are a number of men who maybe haven't seen someone who is responsible, reliable, honest as a man in a household or in their circle, I don't know how you teach it. Like, I don't know how you teach. I'm thinking out loud. I'm probably not the best person, because if you've lived through something in terms of seeing it, it's difficult to it becomes second nature to you. Does that make sense? Whereas someone who hasn't seen it, I can understand why. Like, you hear brothers will say like, who get caught up maybe like in the gang life, that it was the streets that raised me, or this rapper, I saw him as like my father figure. I can't relate to that. I could listen to music, but it doesn't mean I'm going to I see Jay-Z as my father figure, or someone that's selling drugs. I can see that, no, that's entertainment. I can watch wrestling and know that that's The Rock. That's Dwayne Johnson. I don't see him as my father figure. But I'm hearing grown men who are like, no, I saw these individuals as like my father because I didn't have a father figure or good father figure in my life. So that's what, again, I'm just saying this out loud because I honestly, I don't know. So in terms of your question, if I'm, to be honest with you, actually, I don't really know, because obviously the best thing is to see it in action, but there are many people that don't have it, haven't grown up with it. So I'd like to even more hear your thoughts, to be honest, on this, because I don't have an answer for your question.
Yeah, what are your thoughts, Nadeem? You have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking about. I keep coming back to this. Something we did recently, actually. It's from the Hikam of Ibn Ata'illah al-Iskandari, who, if people aren't familiar with that, they definitely should read. With a teacher, if not by themselves. But one of the things he mentions in his Hikam, one of the Hikmas, was I'm going to really butcher it, but it's effectively like, don't be a slave to your ego, in the sense that your self-image, right? Your self-image. Don't create a self-image that you're worshipping. So like, you have this self-image of yourself as someone who does tahajjud every day. You have a self-image of yourself as someone who you fast every day, and so on and so on, right? Is that what you're catering towards? Is that what you're catering for? Your self-image? Is that why you're doing the worship, right? And that was such a profound point for me. Like, it seems so obvious when you hear it, but it seems such a profound point for me, because it was like, actually, that's, yeah, we talk about the ego as in, like, for other people, and kind of being on, as you said, Tanzima, earlier on, about being on stage or whatever it is. But even in that fundamental level of like, just, why am I doing things even in secrecy? And is it for my own self-image? And that's such a basic building block to kind of build from there, and then build everything else, right? Where you're really kind of negating the ego, you're really negating your self-image. So I think, and I see it a lot in some of these, Dawah bros. Like, there is a self-image, isn't there? Like, there is an image that they're projecting of themselves as intellectual defenders of the deen, against feminism and against women, apparently, right? And polygyny is the solution, because that's, anyway. But they definitely have that. I don't want to pathologize anybody, but there is within that kind of like crowd that sense of like, this is our self-image, this is who we are, and this is who we would always be. And it seems like it's just like, you haven't. You've gone, okay. Maybe you've gone and learned fiqh, maybe you've gone and learned aqeedah, but you've not done that spiritual side of it. You've not done the tarbiyah, and tazkiyah, and kind of like rid yourself of that. Yeah, and I think archery and horse riding actually really are beautiful examples of this. In fact, funny enough, today I was in a class with when I asked him, who want to get on the podcast as well at some point, but he was making this point. He was saying, like, it's just, it requires a lot of concentration. It requires a lot of like precision. He made the point about Zakaria alayhi salam, who was a carpenter, and that he was very precise, and prophethood requires precision. And I think it speaks to what you're saying as well, Habeeb, as well, about precision in language and precision in being like, when people would come to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he was like, no, did you do zina, or did you kiss, or did you? And there's precision in that, precision in everything you do. And I think that's a masculine and feminine trait. I think, you're being precise, being kind of like really, really focused when it requires it. That we don't hear a lot about. And then focusing the self-image and focusing the ego into a direction that is for Allah ultimately, and not for anything else. But yeah, these are my kind of scattered thoughts about it all. Kind of listening to what you guys were saying.
So precision is really interesting. It's like, back to the conversation about language, where it's like, they'll assume that, it's the woman's fitrah or male's fitrah. There's no precision in that. It's just, said without any real backing to, using long language in that context. So inshallah, yeah, like even through archery, like being consistent, being precise is so important. Like that's the basis of archery, and having to be, it requires a lot of training. Like to be able, every arrow you do, like taking a deep breath, like, there's a repetition to it. Like basically the chants that we do is like, Ya Allah, Bismillah, Allahu Akbar.
Mm.
And then within that, you're trying to, really become as precise as you can. And it's very difficult. Like it's really hard. And it takes a lot of practice, a lot of training. Like I'm 4 months in, been doing a weekly, but alhamdulillah, like I'm not like, I can probably hit 2 out of 3 bullseyes or 1 out of 3, but doing it 9 times in a row, that's another ballpark, and that requires a lot of training. But people haven't gone through that training at all. So that's why, like, I don't know, maybe it's the ego kicking in, but that's sort of the yardstick when I talk to like people that deem themselves to be, champions of deen in our community. And I just like to put them through that little low-key litmus test to see, like, okay, have they actually done the training that perhaps maybe hundreds or 500 years ago, maybe even during the Ottoman Empire, during that time, they were doing this training, and just seeing if it kind of holds weight. But a lot of the time, unfortunately, I haven't seen it, and there's a bit of a lacking in our community, definitely.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
And then, so I'm just thinking of like the opposite, because when you was speaking about, like, you hear a lot about, well, do I hear a lot about what it means to be a man? I hear a lot about what is not a man in a lot of our religious spaces, as in the youth, which is often misunderstood and misappropriated and weaponized. But I hear a lot about, that's not, and they use it as an insult, and I think that's something that we can talk about, because the youth and the ghayrah, loving guardianship or protective jealousy, that's something that a lot of men, as well as being a protector and provider, I think a lot of Muslim men, they understand that is what it means to be a man, meaning you're not a dayuth, you have a ghayrah, and you're a protector and provider. I think these are, like, for a lot of Muslim men, that's what is kind of seen to be the definition of what it is to be a man. But do they understand what these terms mean in terms of from our tradition, not how it's been used? Do you know what I mean? I think that's also a problem.
Can I say something here, actually, about providing, right? And I think there's and maybe there's a point here about kind of like how the language kind of veils or hides or is kind of vague enough to kind of like, leave it to your imagination, right? Well, actually, I mean, if we look at someone like Andrew Tate, right? Again, I know you say don't, but someone like him, right?
Yeah.
And when you talk about providing, it's always this thing about like being a millionaire, stocks and investments, and having the latest, fastest whip, and all that sort of stuff. And it's just seems so bizarre to me that that's the image of providing. Whereas, like, if you think about this, about the prophetic, I mean, I'm not saying anything wrong with being rich or wealthy,
Yeah.
but then, like, it's like that you're kind of, and again, I'm not saying women should not have an expectation to be provided in that way, but then there's the opposite of, like, you're a failure if you don't do that, right? And then I think that eats at a lot of men, and a lot of men are like, I'm a failure, and I'm like, and the only thing I can, coming back to what I was saying earlier about control, the only thing I can control is my wife, and therefore that's what I'm going to take out all my frustration of not being an alpha man in the image of Andrew Tate and so on, and that's where I'm going to direct that. Sorry, there's one more, and this was something that came up actually when I was my master's days, and we were looking at the history of colonization in India. And I'm trying to find the reference for this for years and years, but I can't find it. Well, one day I will, inshallah. But there was somebody had this theory about, so what ended up happening in the Indian subcontinent was that almost the opposite. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's slightly similar actually. But women became this deified thing, right? So there's literally like God. The image of India as a god is a woman, right? And it became this deified thing that had to be protected. The virgin, or kind of the Madonna whore complex type of thing. She has to be protected. She has to be virgin, etc., and so on. And someone came up with this theory about, well, this came about because these men lost all their power outside of their home. Right? So they had no say in politics. They had no say in kind of like administration. The colonizers were running their country and taking all their resources. So the only thing that they could control was their woman, right? Was their wife or their mother or whatever, right? Or their sister. And therefore they deified her, then also like caged her in the house and made it, made the domicile kind of like their realm. And that was their realm. And that was it, and that's when you got this kind of like trauma of violence and so on and so forth, because they had to control that no matter what, at any cost. So I think that kind of does play out today as well. From maybe I'm kind of overreading it, but I see it play out that way. Where men are just very frustrated. There's another thing called the I don't know how like developed this is, but it's the Raja complex. I don't know if you've come across it. The
No.
Raja complex, which is like sons in Southeast Asian households are like, you're a son, and that's it. You're amazing just because you're a male, right? It doesn't matter what you achieve; just the fact that you're a male means that you're amazing. And then they end up not achieving anything, right? And then they're like, "But I've been told I'm amazing my whole life, and I can't get a job. I haven't got an education, and I can't do anything. Like, what is on the one hand wrong with me? Why am I not living up to this expectation? And why am I being told that I'm so amazing when I'm not?" So there's that dissonance. There's a dissonance there. And then again, that kind of violence and misogyny, it must be a woman's fault, right? It must be someone else's fault other than mine for not being the image of what I was supposed to be. Sorry, these are my rambling thoughts on on this. Yeah, sorry, are you going to say something anyway?
No, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm just thinking, I can't remember what I was going to say, but I think and what I've noticed again actually is that when people, because I think what people do in the Muslim space, people will take Islamic concepts or Islamic virtues and then they will make it and they will exaggerate it, and that's what defines what it means to be even a very pious person or a man. So, like for example, men will, especially like in my culture, will maybe boast about having a number. The more children you have, the more like it's a sign of honor and virtue. But then it's like, are you looking after those children? Do you know what I mean? So am I going to be impressed if I hear someone say he has 10 children but he's not looking after them? The same way, am I going to be impressed if a man says he has 3 wives but is he looking after them? Is he just to them? The same way, even in a religious space, a lot of people will be, mashallah, that someone's read the Quran X amount of times in a month, but then it's like, but was there tadabbur? Was there contemplation? And you even read it when the person memorized the Quran at such a young age. Mashallah, that's great. But if we look at the best of generation, i.e. the companions, we don't hear those stories. If you think about it, when you read like about the awliya and some of the scholars and their amazing achievements, if you compare it to the companions, it would look like the scholars that came after them were more virtuous than the companions. Just reflect upon it, because you hear about some of the companions that they would take them a month or something to finish one part of one surah, because they'll be going over it and implementing it. But we want to memorize the Quran as young as possible. We want to do so many khatam of the Quran in Ramadan, and we'll be amazed or hearing someone praying tahajjud X amount of times. But then when you read about the life of the companions, you don't hear a lot of those amazing stories. But we know that they were far greater than any scholar that came after. So I think even us ourselves, when we hear again certain virtues, which again is Islamic, like having children, being married, if it's polygyny, but we lose sight of what underpins that. Are you looking after what you are taking on that responsibility? And that's why when we talk about the principles of being responsible, being honest, being a person of integrity, that translates in all generations and all societies. But if we look at what you can quantify, that's when it can be a slippery slope. Because like the same way, if you look at, mashallah, this person is great because they've studied X amount of years, it doesn't mean that they're have more hikmah. Or even if someone to say, I've been married 30 years, that doesn't mean that you're an expert in marriage. But that's how we will quantify, we've got low divorce rates. Does that mean that everyone is happy in those marriages? Did you understand? It's just the way even if you think about, we're of age where we measure success by things that you can quantify. But the things that are really successful from an Islamic perspective, we can't quantify it. Our iman, we can't quantify it. You know, your piety, you can't quantify it when you don't know who's got the person of taqwa. And that's one of also, when you reflect, the beauty of Islam is that you don't know who is really the muttaqun. You don't really know. You don't really know who's the people of piety. And so we will say certain, we think because they speak of the deen, we see them praying, but ultimately we don't know, like you mentioned, the deen, are they doing it because of themselves? For our job? Are they doing it because, so that, and that's also one of the, when I've always thought about, like, that's like the greatest test that we're all on this test in life, but we don't know how well we're doing. Because even if you're doing quote unquote well to other people because you're praying, you're giving lectures, you're doing X, Y, and Z, if you're doing it for the sake of people to say that, you know, you're a scholar, you're an alim, you're going to hell. And that's one of the scariest things, but also one of the amazing things, because it keeps you on guard. When you just reflect upon it, that no matter how practicing or pious you are, or how much people praise you, if you're starting to do that, which can happen, like you're doing it for praise for other people so they can call you this, and no one knows apart from that individual and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you don't know where this person is. And that's why even just when you just reflect upon that, like in terms of no matter how well, quote unquote, you're doing in terms of the practicing, you can never be comfortable. And likewise, someone who is, you know, really astray, there's still hope for them. You read the story about Umar bin Khattab. What was he? Who was he just before he embraced Islam? He was trying to kill the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The worst thing you can do. Then he came to be one of the best human beings to ever grace this earth. You know, so it's even when I just reflect about the test in of itself, the dunya, you can't be impressed by yourself. Do you know what I mean? That's one of the scariest things, but also one of the things that, okay, it keeps you in check. Like when you actually reflect upon it, I can't be, even though you can impress everyone, you can even impress your wife, you can impress everyone, you can't fault Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's something that, again, that's, yeah, I mean, but the thing is, you can't package that and sell that to people. That's also one of the, you know, that's also one of the one, you can't sell that. You can sell the other stuff, the external stuff that people think that indicates or means that you're a religious person or a pious person, but ultimately what actually defines whether you're a pious person or have iman, you can't even actually really teach that as such. So even that's why I've always used to think about that. Like that's even like the life that's done is like the greatest test, because again, everyone's in this test, but you don't know how well you're going. And there's always hope that you can pass the test until you die. Or see the angel of death. Even that in itself, like, subhanAllah, this test is crazy. That's how I used to reflect on that. No matter how well you're doing, because even if you're doing well, like memorize the Quran, this and the other, if you start to doing it, and it's very easy. And that's what I feel for people who are imams and religious speakers, especially when that's your profession. Because one of the things I always try to understand, see where they're coming from. You want to have a purpose in life, right? If you have like a 9 to 5, you've got other stuff that you're doing, and then you're doing the deen, it's teaching the deen on the side, inshallah, you're doing it for the sake of Allah because you don't need the money. When that becomes your only source of income, I don't care who you are, most people, unless Allah's protected you, it can affect you, because naturally you know that, okay, the more followers I get, the more I'll speak about certain things, more likely people are going to invite me to speak again. And it affects your pocket, and you start rationalize it. You've got a family to feed. It's very difficult. That's why I feel for people. I'm not saying it's haram to make money with the deen, but I feel for them, especially if, for example, they've been studying and that's the only way they know how to make money. That's the career they're going to go into. And it's very difficult to always do things purely for the sake of Allah. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, especially when that's just your job. Like you're going to this masjid or you're giving this course. So after a while, you're going to be thinking, okay, there's such and such person's coming. I've been recorded. Make sure you're going to be perform. That's natural, and that's why again I do honestly have a lot of empathy for such individuals, because, and you do see it where people like started a certain way and then they change over a period of time, but it's because they've got mouths to feed as well, and they need to talk about what is going to keep them on the payroll. So but I did like what you said about Tanzim, about if you're, and I think even us, because it's always easy to talk about those who are like the preachers, what have you, but you shouldn't be so obsessed and fascinated by someone, the speaker. And I think that's dangerous. I think, how do we change that mentality where, you can see someone, you should see them for who they are, the human beings. Not to say that every time you look at them thinking the worst of them, but you shouldn't be so absorbed by them thinking because they're a great speaker, because the way they speak about the deen or recite the Quran, that's, I think, just as much of a danger for the individuals themselves, because if this person were to fall or were to do something or to go astray, that affects you, but it shouldn't affect your iman. So how do we also, especially in this day and age of like celebrity sheikhs and celebrity culture and going to events and people want to have a VIP to see a sheikh, or I see things like when people say, oh, this person, because it happens a lot in my community, especially back home, like in Nigeria, where, oh, this person made dua for you. So you think because this person made dua for you, it's automatically going to be, and that I've always been uneasy of, or this person, because they connected to the Prophet, peace be upon him, or a descendant of, we don't know, you still have to make dua yourself. It's okay having ask people, righteous people that we think of, to make dua for, but you have that direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and never forget that. And that's one of the hallmarks of this deen that sometimes people lose sight of, especially when you have personalities that become the representative of the deen, that people just think and focus on that individual. So that's also, again, how do, it's but especially if you're in that realm, as in because you're the speaker, you kind of want to maintain that idol kind of like image. As much as you're saying, no, only Allah, you want people to come to you to be listening, because really and truly, like if people read, like you mentioned, Nadim, when you said, I forgot the book where you said, if you read, what the first thought that came to my mind when you said that? People not going to read that book. That's a problem. That's also the problem. Because I used to say that a lot. If you read it, most Muslims are not going to read. They want entertainment. They want, let me listen to this podcast while I'm driving, or they're not even going to read. So even your sources, they're not even going to, even if you say read this, most people are not going to read it. That's the problem. So there are a lot of people that do need to hear, because they're not going to go to the source information, which is fine. But then it's it's just because honestly, because that's the first thing that came to my mind. They'll be thinking, who is that Imam? Who's that? Because it sounds like a nice name. I'm not going to read his book. And it's in Arabic. And even if it's in English, I can't afford it. Let me just see what else is on Netflix or YouTube. And that's why they need like these individuals to be given these talks, because they have done the work and they will say it in a way where it's easy, accessible, and people can digest it. But because again, like even when you reflect and think about it, there's no book from any alim, from the awliya, there's no explanation, there's no lecture that is better than the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the things that I miss, especially when I was in Egypt, there was so much emphasis placed on the Quran. A lot of Muslims know more hadith than the Quran. A lot of Muslims are like, honestly, don't even, like, I will mention certain things, like incidents or stories from the Quran, and they look at me like with bewilderment, like, where'd you hear that from? We should be very well, not talking about memorization, know the stories that's mentioned in the Quran and understand and to contemplate. And the more you reflect upon it, there's so much gems you can get. And it's like, even if you read it 100 times, there's something else you're going to learn from it. But for whatever reason, I don't know why, but we know more, or like obsessed with. And again, I'm not, of course, hadith is part of our tradition, but you have to understand the context. There's so many, and there's some hadiths that are unreliable. And we're more like, we know that is authentic. Who authenticated it? Is it in Bukhari? Is it? But the book of Allah, Allah's words to us, Allah speaking directly to us, we don't have really a strong connection with that. In terms of understanding, even if you read it in English, like getting the gist of the meanings of the stories, that a lot of people, and that's something that I think, I'm saying me myself included, because someone has said, how can you always talk about hadith or this scholar, that book? You don't really talk about the Quran. And one of the reasons was because the Quran is like, maybe that's how I was taught, it's like, you have to be careful speaking on the book of Allah. So because of that, that's why even posting verses, I don't like, because I post some other stuff, I don't like to even mix up with the verses of the Quran. But then those same people are in need of the Quran more than anything else. Does that make sense? So that's also, I'm trying to be like, how do I encourage people to, for themselves, not just to listen to it, but develop a relationship with the Quran? Because that's what saved me, if I'm going to be completely honest. It wasn't lectured, it was the Quran, and just listen to it, because I didn't really want to practice, and just like, this is not from any human being. When you're listening to these stories, this is not from any human being. You want to understand it more, it's like, okay, this is something else. And then you start studying the other sciences. But it seems like a lot of people were pushing people towards the other sciences. Fiqh is good and all, but the Quran is the essence, because that is the miracle that we have, that the Prophet brought, that we have, that we can actually access the same the exact same Quran that the Prophet recited to companions. Just think about it. We are reciting exactly the same Quran, the exact same story. We know that word for word, but we don't treat it with the same haiba as we do with everything else. That is might be incorrect. There might be, do you understand? And that's I don't know if it's a language barrier as well, because when I speak to Arabic speaking people, even if they're not maybe so-called religious, whatever, they've got a stronger connection because they kind of understand with the Quran. Whereas for those of us that Arabic is not our mother tongue, and maybe it's only those who maybe studied, they don't have that connection with the Quran. And again, I'm not talking about memorization, just to have that connection that, like you can be listening to a verse or you say it play in the background and it hits you differently. And that's the beauty of the Quran, but you won't get that with anything else, any other book or fiqh or Sufis. You won't get that with anything else. But again, that's why I'm always struggling. How do you encourage or get people where they feel like, no, I need to, not just waiting for Ramadan to listen to the Quran for Taraweeh, and then, oh, mashallah, I've done the 27. I made up to the 27th night. Do you understand? That's now become, like the goal. I don't know. I'm kind of like rambling on a bit again, but that's something that I'm just kind of thinking of. But sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's super important when it comes to establishing that relationship with the Quran, and also, doing the learnings, but also, cultivating the spirituality is super crucial as well. And yeah, we're sort of lacking in, unfortunately, as a community on all fronts in that sense. So inshallah, hoping our community, we can grow and understand these conversations in a nuanced manner. Because yeah, like once you going through that training and learning, and also not just like kind of fixating on Islamic knowledge in of itself, but all kinds of knowledge and kind of bringing it together. I think that piece is also missing for a lot of people, right? Like I know me and Nadeem have all these conversations about other types of, quote unquote, like knowledge in academia or Western, based knowledge that we need to really delve into, understand, and bring that to the tradition, inshallah. But I know we talked for a while. I don't know if Nadeem had any final thoughts, but I'll probably wrap up very shortly, inshallah, if you had any thoughts, Nadeem.
No, man. I think, I think everything's kind of, there's a lot that's been said. I think it's come back to that whole question about what is masculinity, right? And not kind of like the grifter version of it. But it's more kind of like I'm thinking about it and thinking about what that means. And I think that's an ongoing thing. So I'm still not sure, to be honest with you. I mean, there's so much, right? There's so much in what you can say, right? I mean, there's hadith that mention Allah is Rafiq. He's gentle. Right, so I mean, are we not going to be gentle? If Allah's gentle, like, what does that mean for us, right? And so on. So, you don't hear these hadith in like masculine. You're masculine, and you're going to be tough and just kind of like unapproachable. And yet, Rasulullah was known for his smile and his approachability. So, but you don't hear that. You don't hear that from a lot of the so-called du'at, unfortunately. So. There's a lot, and I think it is. I think that there is a lot of they're able to hide behind a lot of ignorance, right? People think they know kind of what, like, we were talking about Fitrah and ghayrah and stuff, and like people kind of think, yeah, we know those terms, and you really don't. I'm not saying I do. I'm not saying that I'm better than anybody else, but there is a lot of ignorance that veils people from what really is kind of in the tradition, I think. And that's probably what my wrap up would be for this.
and a lot of, like, I guess, give context, like, it's in terms of what the Sahaba went through. If we truly understand that, like, I don't think we can even ever think about comparing. Like, we talk about, it was interesting, Habeeb, you mentioned with the, strong believers better than the weak believer. And then, people are tensing in the mirror and showing, they're a strong believer. But I actually, this was one of my archery teachers in Sydney. Like, he was talking about how people, like, he's a bit, I don't think he shuns going to the gym, but he's a pretty strong guy himself. But he has questions about how strength is discussed in this day and age. So he'll say, like, what if strength is like holding a feather for like a few hours compared to just lifting something heavy for a short period of time? right? And so even historically, like there's a lot of studies coming out, like because unfortunately, like with the whole, showing the muscles and this and that, it kind of ties into capitalism and commodification and kind of selling products, all that kind of stuff. So it gets championed quite a bit. But if we look at truly strong people, they want the bulkiest looking people. They will actually, and things are coming out now about fascia training and how to train the fascia, and a lot of things can be incorporated into like yoga that doesn't look fancy, doesn't look, interesting compared to lifting something heavy. So it kind of makes you having to rewire your thinking, even subconsciously, like what we've been trained to think about certain topics, unfortunately. So inshallah, we sort of developed the understanding. But I appreciate your time. But I don't know if you had any
Yeah,
sort of final
just
words
before we end,
wrap up.
I'm glad what you just said. It just totally escapes me. You gave a brilliant example that we can look at. That's a recent event of what you're speaking about in terms of when we think about masculinity, like the muscles, the bulging muscles, and this, that, and the other. The shooting in Bondi Beach. That I forgot the name. Is it Ahmed or something? The person that took the gun off the person that was shooting innocent individuals. That is courage, that is strength. But physique wise, if you saw him, you just think as a everyday average man, an uncle, whatever. But that's again when we're talking about courage, bravery, that you can't. Again, it's very difficult for him if that without that event happening, and he were to say I'm the bravest person, or if someone were to say this is the hero of 2025, so to speak, people would be like, "What are you talking about?" Like the man of the year, because he doesn't have the bulging muscles, he doesn't have the look, the aesthetics. But an example of selflessness. He was willing to risk his life for people he doesn't know, non-Muslims as well. And that's a great example of like, in terms of what is true masculinity compared to the performative masculinity that we see of a lot of gym buffs and things who might have the appearance of that they're really strong, but when it really matters, I'm not saying that they won't be there, but again, that's when you really determine who is the person of strength, because you can have all the strength in the world in terms of going to the gym, but when it really matters, when you're supposed to use it, are you going to use it? Do you understand what I mean? And that's where I'm just saying, like, and I agree with you, like the commodification of masculinity, the way it's sold, because they will be saying we're training, we're doing all of this for, if something were to happen, but you don't ever see it come to fruition. Whereas someone who maybe, because of the way he's been raised in terms of looking after the defenseless, speaking out or trying to protect all those who are the most vulnerable, when something happened, look who stepped in front. That's, for me, that was a great reminder, honestly, wallahi, that incident and how he, detained that individual and was willing to risk his life and even got shot in the process. That was a real example for, especially for Muslim men, young Muslim men in particular, in terms of who you're looking at in terms of what it means to be a man and, masculinity and this, that, and the other, because it should be about selflessness, responsibility, courage, and being a person of integrity and virtue. And that doesn't always look pretty on the eye. That's my understanding.
Yeah, definitely. And this might not be related, but speaking on also sacrifice, like a lot of the examples from the time of the Prophet, like we hear about, like, I think it was Uthman Radian who would come from an expedition, make so much wealth, but then when the Prophet asked for money for expedition, he's willing to give up everything that he's made. And this was like, we're talking like hundreds and thousands of dollars, like just, in a snap of the fingers, just giving it away. And that's the kind of mindset we need to cultivate, inshallah, on top of everything else we sort of discussed, which is unfortunately missing in that sense, because especially in a capitalistic world, like we're all trying to take from him. So like even the whole, like people talk about, businesses and everything, like a lot of the stuff that I read, a lot of the stuff when I, access content, even when it comes to Andrew Tate or Tim Ferriss, whoever it is, at the essence of it, there's a level of exploitation that they promote. Like when it comes to, the employees that they hire or the way that they try to frame their discussions. Like when I read that, I feel uncomfortable, even as a Muslim. It's like, we should be trying to empower them in every way. But then, at the lowest common denominator, there's a level of trying to exploit these kind of people in situations. And that's, I find that unmanly. And it's unfortunate because that whole mindset of business and this and that is being propped up in the Muslim community. But obviously it's important in that sense, but it's also important to be mindful that we have our own ethics to take into consideration, inshallah. So yeah, I know I said a lot, but I don't know if you had any other final thoughts before we wrap
No,
up, inshallah.
Barakallah, I think no, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you for hosting me again, and hopefully we can connect again. But keep up the good work as well, because I think it's also important to let people know when you're benefiting from something, and I'm benefiting from your work, and I'm sure people are. So it's important that we vocalize our appreciation for people doing things that we benefit from. So just wanted to say both of you, may Allah reward you both for your endeavors and continue to having these difficult conversations and much needed conversations that many people maybe are unwilling to have.
I appreciate your time. Like, I know you spent a lot of time on this show, so I appreciate your time and discussing this. And we've had a lot of with our conversation that we've had, just sort of flow. So we sort of are like minded in that sense. It definitely helps. So we didn't even end up covering the episode plan that we intended in that sense. So that's beautiful, mashallah. We're able to talk about so many things. So inshallah, definitely we'll get you on again and talk many other important topics. So yeah, we'll wrap it up there, inshallah. So thank you for tuning in, listeners. So if you want to check us out, we're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, Apple, iTunes as well. Inshallah, support us by subscribing, and check us out on Instagram as well, inshallah. And give us a like and follow. And we'll put show notes to Habeeb's links to his book and to his social media and to other contents as well in our show notes, inshallah. So from our special guest, Habeeb Akande, we wish you all the best. This is Sanzam and Nadeem signing off. Assalamu alaikum.